What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender. Part 10. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. Thanks to the insinuations of his sister and Tai Li, Zuko's trip with Mai was filled with awkward tension. He became very aware of his proximity to the dour girl, and judging by Mai's movements, she was doing likewise. It didn't help that, thanks to the words of his sister and her friend, Zuko had flashes of imaginations where Mai acted very un-Mai-like and beckoned him over to join her in her tent. It also didn't help that Zuko was pretty sure she caught him staring on several occasions, but didn't so much as stare at him with disapproval, being stuck in a dangerous situation. It came with great relief when they met up with the squad that AZULA had promised. The presence of other soldiers helped banish most of the tension, and also allowed the prince to keep some distance from Mai to clear his head. That such sessions required privacy was not an issue. The training from the 11th allowed Zuko to be discreet enough to banish his fantasies into the bushes without anyone noticing. The rest of the journey south became uneventful after that, boring even. The colonial soldiers kept to themselves, fully out of perceived deference for his standing as more than just a soldier of the 11th. Zuko was an exiled prince, but that still commanded some form of respect from the colonials, it seemed. He didn't know whether to be thankful or annoyed at that. On the one hand, it was nice to know that people still held him in some regard despite his disgrace. But at the same time, Zuko was starting to enjoy the camaraderie that his position as crown prince could never give. It almost hurt to realize that he couldn't trade banter with these soldiers. Well, at least Mai was still treating him normally as Mai perceived it anyway. Private Zuko, set my tent up. Yes, Lady Mai, he answered stoically, long used to acting as a servant for Mai's and Tai Li's wry amusement. Strangely, AZULA didn't see it as such indeed. His sister barely reacted at all to his ordeals. Zuko had expected malicious glee, mocking laughter, or even disappointment. It was somehow concerning that AZULA simply stared at him blankly without any biting comment, unless it involved Mai, anyway, and mostly left him alone. In a way, perhaps she truly has grown into her role as a princess, far beyond Zuko's own stunted achievements. Getting his thoughts back to the present, the conscripted prince quickly went to work setting up Mai's camp while she stood by and watched. Before, back when it was just the two of them, Zuko was convinced that her eyes were on him, and he felt the urge to make a show of building up her tent. Now, with other company around, self-consciousness crushed that urge, but the feeling of being the object of Mai's attention did not fade. This was so weird. With aid of information from a messenger hawk, they found former Governor Akano and the refugees of New Ozai in one of the vassal towns. Guards, officials, merchants, they all looked worn and dejected, but unscathed. Colonial soldiers were spread throughout the group, either handing out food or talking with the refugees. There was also a slight but noticeable relief from Mai's sagging shoulders as she saw her family, while they were far less reserved when they caught sight of her. Mai, her mother, Michi called out as she ran over, Mai's baby brother in her arms. We were so worried about you. Mai gave a derisive snort, though now Zuko could tell that it was out of habit instead of any real apathy. I'm fine, Mom. I'm the one coming here looking for you. It's good to see you unharmed, Mai, Michi said, ignoring her daughter's assurances with a maternal relief that made Zuko feel enviously uncomfortable. Yes, we're glad that you've come back for us, Akano said with genuine gladness. And again the prince had to shove down the pang of envy. Mai did a very good job of looking unperturbed, though her hand strayed to pat on her brother's head. The crown princess asked me to make sure that you guys are safe. She's also very worried about the loss of New Ozai, and is already working to address that issue. Bringing up New Ozai made Akano visibly shrink back and glance away nervously. All right, we're grateful for Her Highness' concern. Yeah, Oh, she also asks you to wait a bit before returning to the home islands, Mai said too casually. Something about her father needing time to. She paused and turned to Zuko. Calmly collect his thoughts, he added with all the diplomatic niceties he could manage. Right, that. Akano got the meaning, judging from how his face paled, and his head bobbed up and down in a rather comical nod. I see. We'll stop by the nearest colony port town then. I'll use the time to compose a report for the Fire Lord. As his words trailed off, Akano finally turned to Zuko and squinted, trying to peer through the chainmail veil that covered the prince's face. Prince Zuko. Private Zuko, he corrected, and immediately did not like how Mai's father's face lit up. Akano promptly bowed, making Mai roll her eyes. I'm grateful for your presence as well, Your Highness. His daughter groaned in annoyance. AZULA assigned Zuko to be my bodyguard. That's why he's here, Dad. Bodyguard. Akano looked to Mai, and then to Zuko, and then back to Mai with a great smile. You must have done well to gain the princess' trust. Ugh, not now, Dad, please. It's already boring enough as it is loitering here. Let's get you all to the nearest colony, and then at least it'll be more comfortable there when you bore me to death. With more colonial soldiers to escort the refugees to the nearest colony port and handle the chores, Zuko found himself sticking close to Mai again as a dedicated bodyguard. Unfortunately, it also meant guarding over her family. Oh, Mai's mom was polite and courteous, and Tom Tom was cute. But it was her father Akano that gave the prince the heebie-jeebies. The way the man liked to walk up and initiate conversation felt like the former governor was interrogating and kissing up to Zuko at the same time. Thanks to his time being exposed to Azula's scheming while he watched Mai in the background, Zuko was immediately aware of Akano's attempt to weasel into his good graces. The question then was, why bother? Why was Mai's father treating Zuko with such unwarranted interest, when he was a mere foot soldier right now? Zuko couldn't help him against the Fire Lord's inevitable wrath, nor did he have any pull to secure any resources for Mai's family. Yet here Akano was, buttering him up for some yet unknown reason. I've lost all royal privilege, so please call me by my rank, Zuko insisted, but the man barely acknowledged it. As you say, Private Zuko. Please, once again, let me say how grateful I am that Your Highness is looking over my daughter. Ugh. Just out of sight, Mai was palming her face and shaking her head as she went to get her mother. Michi couldn't come soon enough to save Zuko from the pestering. As I said, sir, it's Princess AZULA who assigned me to watch over Lady Mai, the prince said, still trying to be polite. It wouldn't be good to hurt the family of the girl he was guarding, after all. Yes, but still, I hope that Mai didn't cause too much trouble. Michi finally came over to interrupt by laying a firm hand on Akano's shoulder. Dear, stop disturbing our daughter's bodyguard. Thankfully, that kept Akano away for a while. Throughout the rest of the journey, Mai's father would appear to just about repeat the same things over and over again like a persistent petitioner, until Mai had enough and positioned herself, and therefore Zuko, far ahead of the convoy. I'm sorry about my dad, she offered blandly as they rode their ostrich mounts in silence. It's all right, Zuko replied. I'm sorry about my dad too, for what her father would most definitely be put through after this. It seemed that despite the massive loss of Ba Sing Se, there was still hope to be found. Sokka was glad that the kooky King Bumi had freed Omashu by himself. If even the Fire Nation couldn't stop that piece of gossip from spreading across their land, it must have been a real scene indeed. Aang had wanted to head back to Omashu when they heard the news, but with Toph's aid, Sokka convinced the Airbender that they were already too deep in the Fire Nation territory to leave now. They needed to gain information about Xing. Having the royal engagement between the Scorpion and the Fire Nation princess helped sway their argument. Xing was growing in power, which made it even more imperative to figure out his intentions before working with him. Trustworthy people don't just use the name Scorpion after all. Stalwart and dutiful. Those were far more respectable names, Sokka felt. Yet, back when the gang passed through the Fire Nation colonies, the folks there, Fire Nation colonists and conquered Earth Kingdom alike, seemed to have a very positive view of Xing. If you believed everything they said, the Scorpion was responsible for saving several of the colonies in the past from Earth Kingdom raiders. The story of his near death at Tai Plains was always told with heavy emotion and surprising venom towards this Shirluo fellow who sent the 11th to their near extinction. The colonists said that Xing was the reason the Earth Kingdom kept to their side of the border nowadays, while the Earth Kingdom refugees actually thanked the guy for being merciful. Merciful. Xing, the guy that burnt Zhao in half and tore through the daily. But then again, Sokka remembered the protectiveness Xing showed towards the Kyoshi warriors. So maybe him not harassing Earth Kingdom towns and villages could be taken as truth by now. Everyone praised Xing for sticking to the whole rules of war, things so Xing was only brutal towards enemy soldiers. And somehow that's acceptable? Weird, but the more Sokka thought about it. Anyway, the perception of him soured somewhat when the gang reached the Fire Nation home islands. The merchants and townsfolk still lauded his achievements. But Sokka noticed some of the folk subtly sniffing or scowling whenever Xing's name was brought up. Katara had the right idea of stopping the impromptu survey before it drew suspicion. But it still left them at a loss on how to proceed. We could try to find a firebending master by ourselves. Aang thought aloud, but Toph snorted at the idea. Do you really believe that, Twinkletoes? I say we're just putting off the inevitable. I mean, yeah, he's ruthless, but Xing's a soldier, right? Maybe that's all he knows how to be. Kinda like how Sokka only knows how to crack off lame jokes. Hey, now that was uncalled for. Katara ignored her brother's outrage and was tapping a finger on her chin in thought. It's not the best point, but that's still valid. Everyone keeps going on about how young Xing was when he joined his regiment. Aang paused, and then sighed, running a hand through the burr of growing hair on his scalp. I guess. But then again, he didn't say he'd be the one teaching you, right? Katara said, trying to find the silver lining in the matter. So maybe there's a chance that he'll find you a decent firebender. The Avatar scrunched his face up. Yeah, right. Knowing him, he'll put me up with some firebending soldier that has done a lot of bloody and horrible things, so he can toughen me up or something. Yeah, that was a valid point. Xing made his disapproval of Aang. The gang's supposed naivety quite clear. There was a chance that the Scorpion would try to put Aang through military training. But still, you can always refuse his offer if the firebending master is a douchebag, Sokka said. Xing's a prick, and he might be doing the right thing the wrong way. But I'm sure he can take no for an answer. Aang gave another, more drawn-out sigh. I hope so. Let's be real here, Toph cut in. Xing's been lenient on us so far. Otherwise, we'd all be dead by now, plain and simple. I saw what he did to the daily. He's being really careful with us in comparison. Sokka involuntarily shuddered at recalling the details Toph so unhelpfully provided in great detail about her time under Lake Laogai. But we can't just blindly trust him, Katara said, restarting an old argument. Of course not, but it doesn't mean that he's not giving Aang an opportunity to learn firebending that's proven to really work. The blind girl put her hands on her hips. You might hate losing to him, and I can't imagine how much it hurt, but he kept to his word and you're fine now without missing body parts. It's be stupid to not try and learn his bending. Aang finally relented with a resigned nod. I guess. I just wish it wasn't so hard to hate or like him. Sokka didn't fully agree with that, but he kept silent. By his estimation, it was far easier to like the guy now despite the bloody trail he left in his wake. He dealt with Zhao and the Dai Li, and nobody's got a word to say against him about how he deals with innocent civilians. But Aang was still trying to deal with the whole idea of murdering the right people being a good thing, where Sokka had already more or less accepted the ugly fact. Well, look at it this way. If Xing's really not the awesome guy the Fire Nation news keeps making him out to be, and he ends up treating Boss Sing-Se badly, you'll be right there as the Avatar to put him in his place. You're making it sound far easier than it actually is, Sokka. Maybe. But you got us to help deal with him. Us? Both Katara and Toph asked in unison in equally unimpressed tones. Sokka raised his boomerang defensively. What? I can fight. I've been fighting. The conversation came to a halt as the evening skies lit up. The gang looked up, even though Toph, couldn't really see, and awed at the rain of stars streaking across the skies. Sokka had a harsh realization that night about his actual contributions to the team as they battled to end the massive inferno from the impact of a falling star. Thankfully, the nearby town that they saved was home to what was arguably the greatest Fire Nation swordsman. Not wanting to slow Aang's date with firebending any further, Sokka convinced them to leave him in Shujing, promising to seek them out once his training under Master Piandao was completed. It was an invigorating experience, especially after he realized how effective and enlightening the lessons were. Sokka left Master Piandao's estate mere weeks later, wielding a sword made from a piece of fallen star, the knowledge of how to use it, and an appreciation for Pai Shou. Congratulations, Colonel Mosey. With those damning words, Mosey's fate was sealed. He managed a stiff nod as he rose from his kneeling position, barely aware that he gave out a rather sloppy salute to the smirking princess before him. This unwanted promotion was inevitable as Xing became Prince Xing. It was, from what Mosey understood, a compromise to both reflect on his new rank, as well as appease the War Council. Xing would relinquish control of the 11th, as a prince engaged to the crown princess should not be a mere colonel, but he would also refrain from seeking the rank of general for the time out of consideration for his age. Mosey and everyone else in the regiment knew that the loss of official title meant nothing at all. Xing would continue to lead the 11th, only from the shadows this time, as he used to do. If he didn't, Mosey would have to consider how best to beg the princess for Xing to reassume control. Nobody wanted to steer the regiment without Xing at least providing some whispered guidance, Mosey included. In the same manner, Koshi and his team would continue to guard the young prince while Mosey sought his own bodyguards. They would be officially transferred from the regiment, but some minor accounting bending would see that they would remain listed under the regiment's roster to ensure that they got their pensions when the time came. "I thank you for the honor, Your Highness." The good-natured chuckles around him felt like stabs of treacherous daggers. Xing was chuckling along, and walked over from AZULA's side to pat Mosey on the back. "Look on the bright side. You don't have to meet the civilians anymore. You can delegate now." It was some comfort, for sure, a great one even. But still, Mosey sighed. "The marriage proposals will get worse now, and I haven't told my parents about Li Ming yet." Xing had the decency to appear somewhat sympathetic to his plight at least. "That's partially on you, and you know it. You should have just sent the news back home when you surrendered to Li Ming." Mosey's eyes went wide with fear just thinking about the consequences of that. The sheer scandal of being the first of his family to officially wed a lowborn commoner, an upsullied Earth Kingdom peasant at that. He might not get the chance to be disowned, simply because his strict, uncompromising parents could very well die on the spot from hearing such news. He'd hoped to wait until he and his lover could settle down to have kids, on the chance that presenting a grandchild would significantly soften the blow. That, or figure out a way to fake his death while he hid away in the colonies with Li Ming. The other option was to take her in as a concubine, but that was beyond an acceptable choice for Mosey, even if Li Ming was fine with that. "You know," Kai said in a teasing tone to the side, "for a dutiful and reliable officer, it's weird to see you so torn over this." It was true, but it still hurt to hear it. Stuck campaigning most of the time, Mosey had allowed himself to vacillate between love and family obligations. For years already, fear of his parents' esteem stalemated evenly with his devotion to Li Ming, with neither side overcoming the other. What didn't help matters was that Li Ming was perfectly understanding and appreciated his predicament. Even now, she only smiled at the ribbing sent Mosey's way, and still defended his virtues as Run and Ping had their arms around Li Ming's shoulder, and lamenting on her behalf at her partner's lack of commitment. Spirits, even the princess and her friend were shaking their heads as it went on. Eventually, though, Xing tossed him a surprising lifeline. "Well, if your parents are only in it for the prestige, how'd they feel if you were marrying a noble?" He held up a hand to stop Mosey's protest and turned to the princess. "As a prince, can I hand out titles?" His fiancée frowned for a moment, and the whole room went silent with anticipation at the idea. "It's possible, but the title will carry little weight in the home islands, especially since my father did not officially bestow it. Well, some weight is better than no weight. But as the crown princess soon-to-be consort, it'd still be something." Despite her face coloring a little, AZULA didn't break from the serious consideration, nodding to the question. "If you word it right." Xing immediately spun towards Li Ming. "Works for me. Li Ming, kneel, please." "Huh. Wadash." Stunned by the sudden intense attention, Li Ming looked lost as she slowly got down to her knees. "A formal salute, please, Li Ming." She did so, bowing slightly and bringing up her hands palm over fist before her lowered head. Just to the side, the crown princess and her friend looked on with amusement, but everyone else seemed to be taking the scene with just as much seriousness as Mosey. "So, Li Ming, for your generous and unconditional aid and support of the 11th Royal Regiment through its highs and lows, for your unswerving loyalty to the Fire Nation. I, Prince Xing of Ba Sing Se, hereby bestow upon you the title of Lady of the Western Upper Ring. As befitting of your rank, you will be awarded a compound close to the royal palace." Li Ming's eyes went wide, shooting a glance to Mosey for help at the sudden gravity of the situation. Thank you, my prince." Xing gave a nod, and then turned to his fiancée. "How's that? Too short." The emphasis on the 11th being a royal regiment was good, but you should have provided solid examples of her feats. Beside her, Tai Li raised a finger to add her own 2 copper pieces. "You could also elaborate on the responsibilities that come with the elevation." Good points." Xing hummed for a moment before looking to the other officers. "Anything else to make this more official?" Some ideas were brought up, and the new prince then turned his attention back to a petrified Li Ming. "So round 2. She went pale, and Mosey had to quickly swoop in to stop her from fainting. It was decided to just get a scribe to record the amended formality on paper. There were enough witnesses, plus royal presence, to make it count. "So now, you can say you're marrying above your station, Mosey," Xing offered with a smile. It almost lifted Mosey's mood too, if not for his comrades' following words. "Since Li Ming's a higher rank, does it mean you have to bring your family over to pay their respects?" This time it was Li Ming who had to hold on to her partner before he fainted over. After the officers of the 11th were dismissed, and Kai and Rufin dragged their new colonel away, AZULA stood with Xing just in front of the throne. Neither of them would sit on it, they decided. It was better to symbolically acknowledge the Earth King's seat being tainted by the king's involvement, or lack thereof, with Lake Laogai. Until new thrones were commissioned, neither Xing nor AZULA would be found sitting in the throne room. "So what's next on the agenda?" she asked. "Where is your uncle?" AZULA sighed with some embarrassment. "Still locked up in the royal pantry, picking through the tea leaves. At the rate he's going, it might be prudent to just gift him the palace's entire tea stores. Well, as long as he's occupied." "Quite. With the recent revelations about the Order of the White Lotus, and not only Xing, but Uncle Iroha's involvement in it, the princess actually felt a bit out of her element for once. Xing had revealed what he knew about the secret of order, and left Uncle Iroh to do the rest of the explaining. It was enlightening at the very least, but it didn't truly explain too much. They were an order that shared knowledge, but also sought to guide and protect the Avatar. Yet her uncle was content sitting around and passively observing the world fly past him, while Xing seemed more interested in the Avatar as a political tool than as a savior of the world. There were still other members out in all 3 realms, even, according to her uncle, the upper echelons of Fire Nation nobility. AZULA racked her brain for a night, trying to figure out who could or could not be part of the little order. Still, for all the worry about an international underground network, it was heartening to know where Xing's loyalties lay at least. "As I understand it, the Avatar is an agent of balance, so we have to be sure to carefully define what that balance is." AZULA had felt a stirring of pride at Xing's intentions, though her uncle's protest dampened it somewhat. "I understand your intentions, Xing, and I applaud your intentions. However, we should not interfere directly in dictating the Avatar's duty. You of all people should understand the precariousness of maintaining balance." Xing clicked his tongue at that, but kept firmly polite. AZULA recalled feeling some amusement at how her uncle winced. "With all due respect, Prince Iroh, trying to keep balance is a futile task if you don't address reality. This isn't just some scale to rebalance by shifting the weights around. Too much has changed, too much has been allowed to happen. To simply ask for things to return to the way they were. That is true, the Avatar cannot bring back the thousands of his lost people," Xing interrupted firmly. "The Earth Kingdom's corruption cannot be allowed to resume. The Southern Water Tribe's depopulation cannot be miraculously undone. And the generations of Fire Nation people cannot be evicted and sent back to the home islands that they never considered as their home in the first place." The older prince was silent for a moment before he asked, "What do you suggest then, Xing?" "Like I said, redefine the point of balance. The square has become a triangle, whether we like it or not. Adjustments must be made." It took some further debating, but Uncle Iroh eventually relented to at least save the debate for another time, preferably when the Avatar next showed up. Best of all, he actually looked like he'd consider Xing's point seriously. "If there's nothing else," Xing's voice brought AZULA back to the present. "We have a guest to meet." The finishing touches were being added to resolve the Dai Li issue, The army of colonial officials were still out in the city gathering information. So that was about right. There wasn't anything else to really look into for the time being. AZULA nodded, and Xing gave the order. After some waiting, the throne room's repaired doors swung open, permitting 2 people to enter. The first was a man dressed in a craftsman's apron with an interesting hairstyle and a hand with wooden fingers of all things. He seemed calm and curious, if anything, stealing glances at his surroundings. Beside him was a boy who bore some resemblance, and looked torn between being resentful and awed as he strode into the great hall. Both of them walked right up until the sound of shifting spears hinted at them to stop. The eccentric man coughed before bowing a bit too shallowly for even a minor noble. The boy barely moved until his father's guiding hand pushed him into a similar bow. "We've come as you requested," the man announced. Xing ignored the many breaches of protocol, and so AZULA did too for now. He was smiling though, so the presence of these 2 must be of some significance. "I'm glad you agreed. I hope your journey wasn't too hard." For some reason, Xing was directing his gaze at the boy in particular, who in turn fidgeted nervously and couldn't meet his gaze. "The trip was uneventful. Thank you." Good. We're still clearing out the abandoned land, so there'll be plenty of housing available for you and anyone who followed you here. In the meantime, though, I could use your help in figuring out some things." This time the boy snapped out of his uneasiness to point a finger at Xing. "My father won't help you make weapons." Xing nodded, ignoring the sudden outburst even as the man calmed his son down. "I did not ask you here to make weapons. I'm here to offer you a job, to improve this city for its people's sake. Improving the agrarian zone's food production, resolving the cramped living conditions of the lower ring, sanitation works across the city. I have need for a creative mind to deal with civil engineering. I did put some thought into your talk about sanitation." "Dad, really? Working with the scorpion? Those are interesting problems, Teo. Problems that, I have to admit, I've not really considered until he brought it up, and are now screaming for some solutions." The father looked to Xing with a nod of gratitude. "Besides, I owe you my son's legs." "Legs?" Now that sounded like a tail. AZULA raised her hand to stop Tai Li from interrupting with the inevitable stream of questions. "Though I must ask, will my work be contained?" Xing's smile broadened. "Your inventions will be fully credited as yours, and you're free to market them so long as they're for civilian use. I just ask that as your employer, Ba-Sing-Se will be the first to make use of any innovation that would help uplift its people." AZULA kept herself from frowning. Just who was this man that Xing was trying to win over? "Dad, we don't have to do this," the boy called Teo pleaded. "He's the scorpion, and a prince of Ba-Sing-Se as of a week or so ago," Xing added. "I'm offering this city to be your sandbox, within reason, of course. The downside about this arrangement is that any messes you make will be yours to clean up." That seemed to have clinched it, as the man eventually nodded. "I'm free to leave if I wish? So long as you've given us a chance to discuss things first, you will be free to leave unharmed and unmolested. I'll even have it down on paper if that's of any comfort. As if you won't try to weasel your way through it," Teo snarked, and AZULA began to wonder if the boy really had to be part of the recruitment package. Xing, though, only shrugged it off. "You're free to decline this offer. I won't hold it against you." "No," the man said firmly. "I accept your employment." Then he turned to his son, who looked aghast. "We'll owe it to him to give him a chance, Teo." And then Teo became uncomfortable again, which AZULA found she much preferred to than an antagonistic brat. The little meeting was over after Xing assigned them their quarters and workshop, and AZULA realized the 2 peasants didn't bother to properly introduce themselves. And once more the throne room was quiet again. Tai Li went off to train Bosco the freakish Just Bear, leaving AZULA with Xing in the Great Hall. "Do I want to know the story about those 2? "Maybe," he answered with a shrug. And then AZULA learned of the true fate of the late War Minister Qin, and the fact that Xing could actually heal the crippled with some help. The latter was intriguing, but the former was definitely interesting. It had been an excellent cover-up to shake up the War Ministry of its uncreative deadwood, as well as a fitting end for Qin's arrogance. To resort to weak blackmail to garner a talent that actually created the tanks. If it was AZULA, she'd have captured the mechanist and broken him with reasonable kindness, as she did with the colonies. Who knows what other inventions he'd be willing to part with if he was not only eager, but also properly funded. Now they had to start from scratch. Losing spirits knows what sort of technological progress. Xing was right in manipulating the brilliant inventor to win him over to their side, and to do so in such a way that the man actually felt obligated to work for Xing, while his son had to begrudgingly agree. It shouldn't take too much to keep the duo satisfied with life in the city. The boy could use some encouraging, but the revelation of the die should be of significant help with that. You really thought it out, haven't you? The princess asked her fiancé, very impressed with what he'd just secured for the Fire Nation. Xing shrugged. It's a lot of improvisation, I'll admit. Lots of working with coincidences. AZULA rolled her eyes. And yet it all clicks in place nicely. I suppose you really are spirit-touched. That made him squirm a bit, but he didn't deny it. Rather than having to deal with his bout of humbleness, AZULA decided to lash out at him with a kick. Xing immediately reacted by catching her leg and offering her a confused look. I'm bored, AZULA simply said, her blood already racing from just considering the lengths her Xing was going to secure her position. Securing the Mechanist services, the ambitious plans to win over the Avatar. Not to mention all that he's done so far for the Fire Nation. And more importantly, for her. AZULA punched with both hands, forcing Xing into action instead of mulling uselessly. He let go of her leg and backpedaled, still confused but no less alert. Come, Xing. It's been a while since we sparred. She lunged with a fist, and as her Xing twisted away, her knee shot out to slam into his side. He managed to deflect that by jabbing his elbow down, forcing AZULA to abort the attack or fully lose the initiative. They stared at each other for a while, and it took a few seconds before she saw the light of amusement in Xing's eyes. About damn time, too. Guards, secure the room, AZULA ordered. I want a proper duel with my fiancé. The bodyguards lurking in the shadows left swiftly vacated the throne room through all its exits, sealing the doors behind them. Ready, Xing? AZULA asked, lunging again right as she finished saying his name. Xing swatted her first strike aside as expected, and her follow-up jab almost caught him right in the neck, if not for his own counterattack, which forced her to twist aside or run herself into his foot. Weird time for a duel, he commented at last, but she disagreed with a grin. Do we have anything better to do? Xing conceded with a nod. Point. And then he was skipping aside as AZULA charged at him with a flurry of kicks and punches. None of them landed. You're getting good, my princess, he taunted, causing her grin to grow. Not just good, Xing. AZULA swept in with a low, sweeping kick, quickly changing directions and transitioning to a rising hook from the opposite direction the moment Xing dodged aside. She scored a glancing blow to his ribs as he couldn't fully twist clear, and AZULA's blood raced even faster. I've gotten much better. Really now, Xing said as he lightly patted at his side before slipping into a ready stance. This time it was AZULA trying to dance away as Xing took the offensive. He was right in front of her, and then he was suddenly behind her. She ducked to avoid the falling overhand strike, but overextended by using the momentum to deliver a spinning backhand of her own. Xing caught the extended arm and yanked her towards him, but the princess barely avoided the waiting knee and kicked at his sole-rooted leg to throw him onto the ground. She realized her mistake the moment Xing grabbed at both her wrists this time and pulled her down with him. And AZULA barely had time to react as he was already rolling as he barely landed on his back. She found herself staring up at him, finding the same exhilaration she felt in his dilated eyes. They were both breathing a little heavier, which somehow made AZULA aware of her blood pounding heavily in her ears. Xing lowered himself to bring his lips against hers, and all thoughts of a fight fled as the couple kissed. She woke up with only a gasp this time, her limbs remaining still in the darkness. It was a marked improvement from screaming and flailing about. Suki got up and quickly remembered where she was before calming her nerves. She was on a soft bed, not a hard stone floor. There was no lancing pain anymore. There was no pang of starvation. There were no daily. She rose up to a sitting position and let her eyes take in what they could in the darkness. The window just to the side of her provided comforting starlight to help with that. She saw the outlines of her fellow Kyoshi warriors on their own luxurious beds. Okuni had wrapped herself in a blanket, preferring the stuffy but soft comfort over exposing herself to cold air ever again. Kana had a leg hanging over the edge of her bed, a subconscious comfort to remind herself that she was not locked up in a dingy stone cell. The other girls were sleeping peacefully enough as well, the communal sleeping environment going a long way to help them overcome their fear of the dark and closed spaces. Brazier light leaked in through the door's gap on the other end of the room, reminding Suki of her guardians outside. It took spirits knows how many days for her and her sisters to reach this point, and it was thanks to the people Suki had once considered dreaded enemies. After their rescue, the Kyoshi warriors were treated with a gentleness that Suki could only appreciate in hindsight after the worst of her trauma had receded. She knew that right now there were a pair of soldiers, women of the 11th, standing guard. They were on rotation and would swiftly enter the room should any screaming or breaking furniture be heard. They had held Suki down and calmed her many times already, and they tolerated the violent outbursts of anxiety from the Kyoshi warriors with sympathetic understanding. If Suki called for them now, they'd come in and do their best to fulfill any request she made. Food, water, a short walk out in the gardens. The women of the 11th went out of their way to accommodate the once tortured warriors like doting elder sisters. They also served to carefully filter the rest of the world. It dawned on her recently that ever since they were carried from Lake Laogai, Suki had never seen a male soldier or servant. Every encounter with the 11th or their staff were with women, from the soldiers who guarded them, to the staff that tended to their baths and meals, and the water tribe healers that came every afternoon to provide much-needed motherly advice. Xing's orders, Captain Ping explained as gently. After what your group endured, he thought that you'd appreciate some privacy for the time being. A part of her felt insulted at the gesture, but Suki also conceded that maybe he had a point. The closest encounter Suki had with the opposite sex was just a week ago, when she saw some soldiers walk past in the distance as the Kyoshi warriors enjoyed a quiet walk in the garden. The group were far off enough that it was hard to make out the details of their face, but still the Kyoshi warriors froze, particularly at the sight of the green-dressed Earth Kingdom general. It had taken the comforting voices and pats of their guards to break the sudden lock of nerves and spike in violent urges, and for Sanyang to unclench her fists and stop her broken nails from carving up her palms. The girls had talked about their experience afterwards, with the sagely elder Kylan banishing the shame they felt. The first step to overcoming an obstacle is to acknowledge it, the elder had advised. There is no shame in coming to terms with your affliction. It took me a while as well. It had surprised the warriors to find that the water tribe healer had endured similar abuse, though hers was a longer ordeal that lasted for years before Xing and the 11th came to rescue her. How did you survive for so long? The ancient waterbender shrugged. After a while, it all became numb. I was broken to the point where I didn't have anything left to break. From there, things could only improve. Kylan chuckled hoarsely. Mind you, I still took a while. But Li Dai, the old colonel back then, was a kind soul. Under him, and with Xing helping, the 11th were patient with me and others like me. One of the guards watching them chipped in, and from her Suki learned of Captain Ping. Back then Lieutenant Ping, who served under a different regiment, who had suffered in silence from the vile predations of her peers and superiors simply because she was the sole female officer. Li Dai had somehow realized the fact, and had challenged the Ping's colonel to Agni Kai without hesitation. Colonel Li Dai won, and the lieutenant was transferred to the 11th, the woman said simply, but then smirked viciously. Misfortune struck the 26th after that. Apparently their officers got too distracted by their colonel's loss that they all got careless. Their colonel and several captains fell off their ostrich horses the next day and broke their necks, while the other captains and lieutenants tripped and fell onto carelessly strewn blades several times. For some reason, Xing's face flashed across Suki's mind when the guard finished the tale. The 11th has a thing for looking after certain people, Kylan added with a sly smile. Under Li Dai, they were very considerate jailers. A very good man, one who values kindness over honor. Under Xing, they became very considerate hosts, so much. The waterbender's expression suddenly darkened for a flash of a moment before she shook it off. So much so that many of us, those of us who have no home to go back to, have chosen to stick around. Kylan glanced at the guards with them. Though I'm told we'd be given amnesty? The other guard nodded. The call, Prince wants to offer the 11th's prisoners a chance to serve and settle in Ba Sing Se. The woman exchanged a conspiratorial smile with Kylan, one that Suki couldn't decipher. He just has to deal with the paperwork, apparently. Of course. Well, it's better than having him nag me to take a boat to the North Pole again. Kylan turned to Suki with pantomimed annoyance. The stupid boy had the gall to ask me to go spend my last years with a bunch of sexist pricks. Can you believe that? Suki greatly appreciated the time spent with the women of the 11th, soldiers and prisoners alike. With their help and advice, the Kyoshi warriors stood straighter and lost a lot of their skittish nerves sown during their dark capture. With their help, Suki could go back to the comforting dreams of the pincer protectively pinching around her neck, and the baleful eyes of green-robed men no longer jolted her up awake in cold sweat, rubbing her neck with some affection in the darkness of the Kyoshi warrior's bedroom. Suki quietly got up and snuck to the door. She opened it slowly, peeking to see the faces of her guards looking at her curiously in turn. "Do you need anything, Suki? I'd like to go train a bit." Neither of the women asked her why, and instead one of them led her to the garden while the other kept by the door. There, under the flickering light of lanterns and braziers, Suki went through the familiar stances of the sword and fan, falling into a meditative trance as she reacquainted herself with the motions. She savored the sense of security from wielding weapons again, and was eager to return to top form again, so that she may further hone herself to ensure that she would never be caught off guard again. A sudden movement from behind her immediately snapped Suki out of her movements, and she whipped around to find a familiar face. Crown Princess AZULA stood by with an appraising look, dressed in a modest dress with her arms behind her back. "I'm glad you've made such a remarkable recovery," she said, the cold, pre-dawn air carrying her soft words across clearly. Suki bowed, her hands still holding onto her weapons. "Princess AZULA, don't mind me. I was just taking a stroll." "This early?" The princess eyebrow quirked up. "I could ask the same for you." "Point." AZULA slowly walked over with a harmless smile. "Anyway, how are you and your fellow warriors?" "Thanks to the Fire Nation's hospitality, we've healed up a lot," Suki answered as she headed towards the nearest rack to put away her weapons. "MMHM, not that I wish you gone, but have you girls given thought to my offer?" Suki paused for a moment to sigh before turning to the princess. "We gratefully accept the arrangements to send us back to Kyoshi Island. Though, if it's all right with you, I wish to remain." Princess AZULA looked a bit surprised. "Oh, mind if I ask what you'll do on the continent?" Suki straightened as she took in a slow, steadying breath before she answered. "I'd like to stay in Ba Sing Se and offer what aid I can. Xing, Prince Xing saved us, so as leader, I will work to repay the debt as best as I can. We owe him that much." AZULA frowned slightly, but kept thoughtfully silent for a while. The crackle of fire and the low whistle of a cold wind became all that Suki heard for several long seconds. "I see. Xing did say he had plans to employ us," Suki added with a nod. "After all he's done, it'd be disgraceful if the Kyoshi warriors were unable to offer a minimum of our support." AZULA's frown deepened. "You're selling yourselves short. I've been briefed about what you all went through." The fabric of her dress fluttered prettily as she shuddered in revulsion. "I doubt many could have held on as long as you Kyoshi warriors have, myself included." The princess gave a single, strong nod. Even if it's just you, your services here would be much appreciated. I'll convince Xing." "Convince?" AZULA huffed as she rolled her eyes. "My fiancé is a brilliant schemer, but he also has a soft spot for abused victims. And for some reason the fool feels some guilt for your capture." Buffed, as if he can control what the spirits tell him. "Anyway, he probably has it in his head that it's best if you all went back and recovered for a few years before the Fire Nation makes contact with Kyoshi Island again." At Suki's expression, AZULA smirked. "Yeah, my Xing can be surprisingly dense at times. He assumes that the people he has plans for are all fragile porcelains. Whatever plans he had for the Kyoshi warriors, he scrapped because he didn't want to keep you all here to endure whatever torment he thinks you'll endure." "I see." AZULA snorted good-naturedly. "Don't worry, I'll see if I can talk some sense into him. Or maybe I can do a little practice." The princess gave a disturbingly hungry grin as she said the last bit, sending a tingle of unease up Suki's spine. Still, she was speaking on her behalf, so Suki bowed in gratitude. "Thank you, Your Highness." AZULA waved the formality away. "Just AZULA is fine. Your remarkable resolve deserves some respect." "But Suki." "Yes, AZULA?" Suki replied, and almost jumped as the princess' eyes sharpened into a cold glare. "Xing is mine. You can ogle. You can pine. You can wish. But I trust you to keep your hands off claimed property. Understood?" The Kyoshi warrior nodded quickly at that. "Why yes, AZULA." The glare lifted, and AZULA was smiling again as if nothing had happened. "Excellent. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like a quick spar." I hear that you Kyoshi warriors have some interesting techniques, and I'd like to think I have some surprises of my own that you might find useful. Suki almost didn't notice dawn breaking, and the surprisingly pleasant sparring with AZULA came to an end. The princess left to wake Xing up, but not before extending an invitation to an outdoor event in the afternoon. If Suki and her girls felt up for it. We're making our first public announcement by the palace gates. You'll be standing safely behind us. The generals will be kept at a reasonable distance, if you'd like. You don't have to be Kyoshi warriors, just show up as yourselves. Having more people in the background that's not in Fire Nation uniform adds to the air of legitimacy for us. AZULA's honest intentions got Suki to at least consider the offer, and as she returned to her room, she found herself trying to convince her sisters to join her. It'd be a measure of how much they recovered, to see if they could stand a crowd. Their appearance could also be seen as a small repayment for the Xing and the Fire Nation's hospitality so far. So, biting down their nerves, the Kyoshi warriors made themselves presentable, settling on fully green dresses and staying away from the yellow-greens of the Judis, or any fashion styles associated with them. Suki herself added on a red sash around her waist, keeping her short hair loose but neatly combed. None of the girls wore bracelets or socks, donning ornamented slippers or sandals taken from the palace. With the helpful suggestion of their guards, they also kept daggers under their dresses. That little consideration really did make a big difference in how safe the girls felt. When afternoon came, they headed to just outside the palace gates, climbing up to a lavish earth-bended stage and keeping to the back edge of it. As AZULA promised, the Earth Kingdom generals and their people were on the opposite corner, looking resigned and uncomfortable as they milled about. Seeing the heart of the city for the first time, Suki took in the sight of clean white buildings with their yellow-tiled rooftops, and the various trees and ornamentation sticking out of walled compounds. Even before Xing and AZULA appeared, there was a crowd gathering, kept at a distance by Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation soldiers. Several Fire Nation metal vehicles, their infamous tanks, were also parked at junctions, the passengers of the roofless vehicles keeping a watchful eye of the growing assembly. Suki also spied some soldiers with bows lurking on the rooftops, somehow managing to hide themselves amidst the shiny yellow tiles. It tickled her brain at figuring how they managed that, and how none of the city folk seemed bothered to look up at the archers. The sound of horns announced the arrival of Boss Sing Se's new prince, and Xing walked up with AZULA beside him, flanked by their impressively armored bodyguards. He was draped in a red robe of noticeably fine quality that was plain save for the black scorpion with dragon pincers sewn onto the back, while she wore a dress that had gold dragons woven into them at various places. Xing gave Suki and the Kyoshi warriors a glance, and Suki fought down her quickening heartbeat as their gazes met. As AZULA had mentioned, Xing's eyes held a deep guilt, as well as genuine relief. Suki liked to think that the smile he flashed was directed only at her, but she remembered AZULA's words and offered a quick nod in reply. Behind the couple, an old, stout man walked along with a serene smile. He wore the same sort of rich, gold-threaded robes like AZULA, though the patterns were more reserved. Behind him were Kylan and her waterbenders, an old Earth Kingdom warrior leading a group of soldiers in a green-dyed variant of the 11th's armor sans the helmet, and a girl about Suki's age who wore surprisingly little considering the occasion, riding on a bear. Just a plain bear. Weird. It was a rather interesting bunch that stood between the Kyoshi warriors and the Earth Kingdom generals and watched the backs of Xing and AZULA as they addressed the crowd. Xing raised his arms to silence the crowd and gain their attention. People of Ba Sing Se, as you might know, I am Prince Xing, the new administrator of this great city on behalf of the Fire Nation. After its abandonment by the former Earth King, Suki quickly began to tune the words out and felt a growing sense of nervousness at standing in the back like this. She briefly met the gaze of the girl on the bear, who smiled cheerily at her, but it did little to calm her antsiness. Kinda reminds me of our village festivals, Lucci muttered softly. Remember how long Oyaji's speeches took? Suki smiled at the happy past being brought up, while her sisters muttered beneath their breath to add to the light-hearted grousing. She was about to join in about that time with the unagi ruining the communal feast when something caught her eye. It took her a while to figure out what was wrong as Suki scanned the crowd, but eventually, after squinting hard enough, she saw it. A familiar brown mop of hair standing around the third row, resting on a familiar scowling face of a boy wearing a familiar outfit. Jet. Dark foreboding bloomed in Suki core as she identified the boy, and the other Kyoshi warriors also went silent when they heard his name. Where? Okuni whispered sharply, but Suki was already moving, slowly pushing her way in front. One of Shing's bodyguards stopped her, though he regarded her with concern rather than annoyance. Is something wrong, miss? I know him, Suki said, nodding in Jet's direction as subtly as she could, not wanting to accidentally set off a trap. Trouble? The bodyguard asked, and Suki nodded. The armored warrior nodded back and gently pushed her back. We'll take care of this, miss. Thank you. Suki wanted to rage at the polite dismissal, but she saw the man flash a hand signal to his peers, and ever so slightly the bodyguards around the couple shifted. Then one of them glanced up to the sky and suddenly pounced forwards, pushing Shing and AZULA back as he sent a bolt of fire up to incinerate a falling arrow, which promptly erupted into a small but sharp explosion the moment the flames enveloped it. The crowd had a second to gasp before larger explosions tore open the nearest buildings and violence erupted, and chaos promptly ensued. Seeing AZULA so happy lifted Tai Li's spirits almost equally in the same degree. Her royal friend smiled more, and was genuinely more personable despite the hard, steely foundation underneath. The soldiers of the 11th must have really helped AZULA focus her malice, that the palace servants were bowing to her out of deep respect instead of fear. And Shing must have done a really big deal too. Tai Li fought hard to stop herself from teasing AZULA when she spotted the hints of gleeful pinkness to her aura. AZULA, cute and happy pink. Whatever happened the other day must have been great if the princess was smiling warmly for the rest of the day. The uneasy, awkward looks of purple and blue from the royal bodyguards gave Tai Li enough of a hint, or the knowing grins exchanged between the officers of 11th. Tai Li couldn't be sure if she imagined it, or if AZULA actually broke into happy skipping several times. She was most definitely humming, though, and Tai Li caught her friend's hand absently wandering to her chest or groin before she remembered where she was and snapped her limb back to position. Shing was less pink than red, but was still interesting to see how he tried to keep his composure despite breaking into a goofy grin every time he looked at AZULA, and how neither him or AZULA cared that people were present as they quietly held hands and matched pink-red auras, which all meant to say that coming to Ba Sing Se had been the right choice despite the general menace of the recently conquered city. Besides the couple watching, Tai Li got to spend time with the regiment that adopted AZULA, and found them to all be interesting people, if a bit sharper around the edges than my pretended to be. Good people, but not the kind you want to peeve off. AZULA's uncle was around too, and he was always free to regale her with many interesting stories about tea and traveling. More interestingly, the soon-to-be former prisoners of the 11th were also mostly open to conversation. Quite a few of them were wary at first, but after a few days, they tolerated her presence with gentler smiles and less guarded words. Tai Li rarely focused too much on what the people she interacted with said. She just liked watching their auras play out. Iroh had a gentle, breezy glow to his cyan calmness as he talked about the benefits of particular tea leaves, while the soft curmudgeon Yama had a thin shell of spiky yellow aggravation, almost totally obscured his blue-purple melancholy that was specked with deep reds of joy when he opened up about his past as the uncle to the Earth King. There was also a sweet and shy waterbender girl called Yukai that quickly broke out of her timid blue into an excited yellow-red when she spoke of how the 11th looked after her. With how cute she acted, it was no wonder the troops around Yukai kept a protective eye on her. Everyone here was so interesting, and they weren't so stuffy about showing it, not to a friend of the crown princess. Well, maybe the Earth Kingdom soldiers stationed in more public parts were bores, but they were going through a tough time, so Tai Li graciously forgave them. When AZULA invited Tai Li to observe her and Shing's first public speech, of course Tai Li giddily accepted the opportunity. She didn't want to miss AZULA's pinkness when the princess stood with Shing in public. Riding atop Bosco, the fluffy bear Tai Li adopted after the poor thing was abandoned by the mean Earth King, Tai Li fought to keep herself from bursting from excitement as she took in the sight around her. The not-so-formal stage and arrangement of people that would have probably incited scandalous whispers back home, because the public were allowed to get so close without enforcing a proper dress code or something. The surreptitious placement of people on rooftops and street corners. The diverse people gathered behind AZULA and Shing. And Tai Li got to meet, well, take a closer glance more like the group of girls that AZULA highly respected. The Kyoshi warriors had been secluded after their horrific ordeal, and Tai Li understood why and sympathized with them. They were so much more brittle now, compared to when Tai Li last saw them in the colonies. But they were defiantly fighting off the blackness of fear gnawing at the edges of their aura. Tai Li would have to check with AZULA if it'd be possible to meet them. Maybe she could help the girls in some way or another. Such strong people did not deserve to have such ugly black horrors tainting their auras. The whole speech thing was going off well enough, judging from the silence of the crowd. There were bubbles of anger and resentment, but it was understandable, expected even for circumstances like this. Some people were particularly ugly in their auras due to their hate, but Tai Li shrugged it off, trusting fear of the Fire Nation to keep them in line, like the various villagers she'd encountered in the colonies with AZULA. It was a mistake, it turned out, because Suki, the Kyoshi warrior leader, was suddenly moving with worrying urgency, and the guards around Xing and AZULA sparked orange in alertness. Then one of them launched a fire bolt into the air, causing a disappointing explosion, which was soon followed by several more explosions from the nearby noble mansions. Tai Li was caught by surprise for a moment as she saw people burst through the debris cloud of the ruined buildings. Full overwatch. Xing's order had the bodyguards and soldiers of the 11th snapping into action, stepping up to blast down the larger pieces of flying masonry with their fire. Armed people, all dirty and desperate, pushed through or simply cut their way through the crowd, sowing blind panic. The archers and firebenders on the rooftop let loose their projectiles, picking off some of the scowling terrorists. But then arrows from seemingly all around began to zip towards the soldiers' position. "Down with the Fire Nation," someone yelled, a hate-wreathed boy with novel hook swords, and the cry was echoed by his accomplices as they tried to charge towards Xing and AZULA. Tried, because the 11th were making it very hard for them. The boy was the closest, and he recklessly darted forwards with a bestial scowl on his face and his blades swinging, ignoring the fact that his friends were still some ways behind him. His aggression was quickly dampened when one of Xing's bodyguards intercepted him. Hook Boy's moves were flashy, but so clearly in need of refinement. The bodyguard barely shifted his head to avoid a wide swing, and used his bracer to catch the second hook sword to yank its wielder towards him. In less than 4 moves, Hook Boy was unceremoniously knocked to the ground with a helmeted headbutt. More of his comrades were pouring over, though. Many wore Earth Kingdom soldiers' uniform, while a surprising number were in richer nobles' attire. The guards on the rooftops were busy dueling with hidden enemy archers to suppress the incoming tide, but it looked like the rest of the 11th had it well in hand. Soldiers stood firm and met the roaring human tide with spears and flaming fists, breaking bones and searing faces with machine-like efficiency. A few more arrows rained down on the stage, but it was the waterbenders and earthbenders that intercepted them this time. Yama and his followers quickly tore up the stage and wall behind them to fling at the arrows, while the projectiles that remained plinked harmlessly off ice shields created by Kylan and her people. "Evacuate the civilians," Xing ordered. "Protect the princess." "Fool, protect yourself too," AZULA added, before turning to Tai Li and flaring into a worried yellow. Tai Li was about to ask why, but her royal friend literally flew over to tackle her to the ground. Tai Li coughed all the air in her lungs out, but her surprise increased when she heard a solid thunk reverberating from AZULA on top of her. "Stop dawdling, Tai Li," the princess admonished as she got up, seemingly unaffected by the small boulder rolling off her back as she got up. "It's not safe here. I suggest you lead some of our guests back." Tai Li blinked several times as she rose up. AZULA had saved her? "Oh, don't worry about me," her friend said, misinterpreting her stare. "I've got armor underneath. You, on the other hand, don't." AZULA had just saved her. Armor or not, she'd thoughtlessly taken a hit for Tai Li. "No," Tai Li said resolutely as the armored forms of AZULA's bodyguards formed an inviolable ring around them. "I can help." She met AZULA's searching gaze for a second before the other girl gave a nod. "Fine. The rabble on the ground should be handled in no time. Can you deal with the hidden archers? Leave it to me, AZULA." And with that, Tai Li launched herself up past the protective ring of armor and leapt her way from walls and cracked columns towards the rooftops. She quickly sped past the clamor of fighting, pausing only to send a few disapproving strikes to some men screaming "traitors" as they hewed through the panicked civilians with their blades. Earth Kingdom armor poorly protected their pressure points, so it was a simple matter of skipping down, immobilizing them with a flurry of strikes to the right places, and then returning to the rooftops as firebenders landed to clean up. She found the first group of archers holing up in an abandoned noble's house. It took no effort in avoiding their arrows, and Ty Lee slipped in through the same window the group was shooting at her from. The men clumsily began to switch to cleavers and axes, but they were far too late. A hard kick into one man's throat sent him grasping his neck as he fell. At the same time, Ty Lee's fingers shot out and stabbed at the exposed pressure points of his comrades she was flying past, numbing their arms and dropping their weapons. A carefully applied sweeping kick as she landed swept off another man to send his head knocking painfully against the wall. And the attack transitioned into an upwards kick between the legs of the remaining opponent, sending him on his knees as he gave a pained whimper. All 5 men were down in barely 6 seconds since Ty Lee made her entrance. The girl peeked out the window to wave down a squad of firebenders soaring through the air, and after waiting for their arrival, she headed off to find some more unwelcome ambushers. Iroh stood protectively with the soldiers of the 11th around the waterbenders and earthbenders, keeping the skies clear of arrows. These insurgents were poorly trained, but there was a surprising amount of them, considering the reports of a relatively docile population. It wasn't until General Fong on the other end dropped into a stance and sent a wall of earth shooting into a squad of firebenders that things clicked. For Ba Sing Se, the Earth Kingdom general yelled, and his men began to engage the surprised men and women of the 11H. His 2 colleagues in the meanwhile were simply stunned, and thankfully neither General Yu, General Sung, or their officers joined in once their senses returned. It was a bold plan, to feign obedience right up until this point, but General Fong had made a huge mistake. He'd placed himself and his secondaries in the heart of the Fire Nation presence, which for all their advantage of surprise, they were still woefully outnumbered. Fire Lancers. For the princess. For Xing. Colonel Mosey rallied the troops and proved the point almost immediately. After the initial surprise and casualties, the Fire Nation soldiers promptly recovered and tore into their backstabbers with daggers and an intimidating ferocity. Those Ba Sing Se officers that were isolated were brought down screaming as the troops stabbed to horrifically maim, not kill. General Fong was immediately beset by a squad of Xing's dreaded Han unit. They lead with jars that poured out noxious fumes as they shattered. Iroh himself had to bring his sleeve to his face as he watched the silhouette of the general and his men coughing helplessly right until the Han soldiers descended on them and brutally subdued them. Elsewhere, more of the rebelling army were pouring in from the ruined buildings, the earthbenders creating ramps that allowed them to leap over the 11th's defensive line to try reaching Xing and AZULA. Neither were making it easy, though. AZULA's blue fire joined her bodyguards as they ruthlessly burned away any and all hostiles in their vicinity. Iroh had mixed emotions as he saw his niece grinning while she set men alight and left them to scream as they burned. Very few reached close enough for the royal bodyguards to actually engage in melee, to the point that they began to fire on other targets engaged with the 11th. A massive armored man appeared, decked out in the ornamentation of a general's champion, roaring a challenge before he charged at AZULA's position. Iroh felt a spike of pride as his niece barely put any attention on the needlessly showy attempt, dismissively flinging a burst of azure flame that broke the man's charge and sent him tumbling to the ground right before her ring of bodyguards. With no immediate enemies to deal with, they dealt with him with appropriate harshness, 2 bodyguards descending on the champion with apathetic ruthlessness before they stomped hard on his shoulders to break the joints. If you're quite done with that, we still have actual threats to deal with. Admirably, AZULA didn't even offer a sideways glance at the beatdown, focusing fully on nearby enemies that she could fling her fire at. Xing, on the other hand, was proving his reputation. Leading his own bodyguards, the young prince carved through the thickest enemy formations like a chopstick through a block of tofu. White flames burst out that had enemies dropping to the ground with blackened stumps for limbs. The bodyguard squad were no less brutal, each taking on 3 or more opponents at a time and leaving behind smoldering, screaming heaps of flesh. Where AZULA bore contempt, Xing was annoyed. He faced down a group of earthbenders, and after a glare they fell to the ground screaming. And it took Iroh a second to notice their feet turning a bright, scalded red. This invisible fire-bending of the Prince of Ba Sing Se was most intriguing indeed, and would definitely require more investigation. What kind of gift did the moon and ocean spirits give Xing exactly? Dimwit Fong. Old Yama muttered from behind Iroh, distracting the prince from the fighting. Knew he was browning his nose a bit too much. Yama stomped his foot to create a dome that protected a squad of the 11th from a mob, and then exploded the dome outwards to pepper said mob with debris. "Ah, come of it," his counterpart, the waterbender Kylan admonished while she smirked and sent a whip of water into a group of charging soldiers. "You're having as much fun as all of us." Yama did not argue the point, but opted instead for a different line of grumbling. To hell with the fun. Boss Sing Se's already got a shit reputation to deal with. Now they're making it worse. Stupid, short-sighted amateurs, I swear. Iroh didn't hear the rest of the grumbling as he stepped forward to blast away some earth-bended boulders. Predictably, spearmen followed up after the rocky projectile, and Iroh was more than ready to knock them down with quick bursts of fire. He'd deal with the earthbender. But the poor man was already brought down by a couple of soldiers jabbing their spears into his shoulders. His old instincts flaring, Iroh took a step back just in time to avoid a series of arrows flying past him and bouncing off the stone wall. After the initial stunt, the firebenders avoided further dealing with the potentially volatile projectiles and wisely left it to the waterbenders and earthbenders while they dealt with other things. It was impressive to see such cooperation between the elements, but Iroh would mull over the idea later. Right now, he was getting distracted. He crouched and stepped into a charging man in the uniform of an Earth Kingdom captain, and then threw him over his shoulders. To dissuade his opponent from rising, Iroh sent a powerful jab down between the man's neck and shoulders that sent his eyes rolling up into his head. Despite the familiar exhilaration of battle rising in him, Iroh went back to his position to guard the water and earthbenders, and contented himself in watching most of the fighting play out. Some of the 11th were on the ground, though their fallen were vastly outnumbered by the growing carpet of smoking or writhing enemies around them. Though outnumbered, the regiment was fending off an entire, admittedly poorly organized, army with admirable effort. With their treacherous general down and unable to lead them, the insurgents rushing the lines acted little better than armed mobs, and fell just as easily to the cold discipline of the 11th. Some firebenders were rocketing through the air to hunt down enemy archers, diving into windows or dousing them with generous servings of fire. Those soldiers still keeping their position on the rooftops provided precise arrow and fire support that picked out leaders or particular threats. The tanks became strong points for firebenders to safely firebend from, the metal hulls protecting them from rock spikes, arrows, and spears. Noxious smoke wafted through the mobs, rendering them into helpless, coughing prey for the soldiers who were far more resistant to easily pacify. General Yu and General Sung were backing into the gate with their entourage, probably questioning their loyalties right now. A collective shriek from the other end drew Iroh's attention to a group of girls, supposedly the rehabilitated Kyoshi warriors, who joined the fray with lone blades and spears. One of them dove straight towards a boy with hooked swords who had been earlier thrown aside. The boy was now up again and trying to gang up with the other insurgents on a squad of soldiers, but had to roll away to avoid the Kyoshi warriors' charge. He rose up with a pretty flourish of his hooked swords, but he didn't last more than a couple of swings before she had her short sword buried in his gut, and a blurring roundhouse kick properly knocked him out of the fight. A blur of movement nearby caught Iroh's attention, and he saw a growling, roaring mob rushing towards Xing. Many were culled by the concentrated fire directed at them, but there were enough of them that some could regret entering within arm's reach of Xing and his men. Axes and swords melted like wax before they could be brought to bear. Glowing daggers were buried into faces and armpits. Several men dropped to the ground clawing at their necks as their mouths leaked smoke. But then something darted out from the dying mob, and Xing leapt back for the first time as a small figure lunged out at him with a short blade. The smaller figure was fast, darting around Xing and his bodyguards and narrowly avoiding their flames. The assassin kept trying but failing to land a strike at Xing, who was curiously having a harder time dealing with his assailant. It took Iroh several seconds before he understood why. Xing's fighting style, while meant for extremely close quarters, worked on the assumption that his opponents were at his size or larger. Judging by how he was suddenly angling his knee and elbow strikes, the young scorpion dragon was unused to facing someone significantly shorter than he was. As a result, he was forced to quickly adapt his moves. His bodyguards tried to intervene, but the rest of the surviving mob was tying them down. AZULA too saw the awkward duel, and immediately turned her attention towards Xing. The small combatant darted about for a while, barely avoiding a fiery death with each failed thrust or slash simply because Xing was barely able to lower his aim. It was this glaring weakness that enabled the assassin to duck and dive in close to land a single, grazing cut across Xing's cheek. Though that was all they'd get. Xing acted immediately by embracing his attacker with both arms, throwing them up in the air, at which point the opponent's surprised shriek betrayed her as a mere girl, and then catching the falling victim by the back and then slamming her head first into the ground, following up immediately with an elbow drop that likely broke several ribs. Unorthodox as it was, the move put an end to the bout that barely lasted 5 seconds. The carnage around them continued, but eventually the mob's spirit was broken. They would have routed, if not for the rest of the 11th's tanks rolling in to block all exits. Instead, the insurgents were rounded up, and Iroh had to look away as the noose tightened around the quailing survivors, and the sound of broken bones and screams of agony echoed down the streets. It was only after all of that Xing collapsed, finally sparking panic among the 11th as the sole wound he suffered spread a sickly purple shade across his face. "I am not furious." Rin frowned at the princess, who still had not wiped the scowl from her face since the ambush a couple of days ago. The only time it faded somewhat was when she visited Xing in his room, who was still recuperating from the near death by poisoning. If not for Kylan's quick intervention, they'd have lost him that day. "You say that, AZULA, but you're still stomping around looking to murder somebody." AZULA snorted. "I am. Fine. Xing is recovering. Everything is being taken care of." Rin quirked an eyebrow. "Then could you unclench your hands right now?" The princess hastily looked down at her fists and relaxed them, watching the color return to her palm and fingers before looking back up to Rin with a heavy sigh. The captain nodded sympathetically and placed a hand behind AZULA's back to gently lead her away from the office. If she wasn't visiting Xing or taking administrative meetings, AZULA had cooped herself in the room to deal with paperwork, particularly on the many prisoners taken from the failed ambush. A literal army's worth of prisoners now sat crippled in one palace wing. It was the most efficient way to secure so many of them with the limited manpower they had. There was none of the usual soft treatment from the 11th. The limbs of these prisoners were hastily broken before they were tossed into one of the many rooms within the palace wing. Food was sloppy, minimal gruel, and the waterbenders helped to clean the holding rooms with callous floods of cold water. Only General Fong was held separately, though his detention was far less comfortable than his men's. Koshi and his team had personally seen to the general's interrogation, having taken personal affront to the attempt that had almost cost Xing his life. For all his bluster, it seemed that Fong broke quickly, barely lasting an hour before Koshi declared the man ready to speak. To save time, only the officers of Fong's army were interrogated, and with far less care than the Dai Li enjoyed. Battlefield torture was messy and quick, but most soldiers like Rin found that it had only a slightly lower efficacy in information gathering over the more formal methods. The biggest difference lay in the survivability of its victims. None of the 11th or their princess cared too much about the insurgents' long-term well-being, not when their fates were already decided. These prisoners would be discarded very, very soon. Not that Xing was going to argue against it, even from his bed. He had awoken shortly after Kylan purged the assassin's venom from his face, and despite the recovery his body still had to undergo, his mental faculties were as sharp as ever. It was only because he woke up so early that AZULA hadn't already ordered sweeping executions. Though surprisingly, he was not going to argue for any sort of leniency. A staged rebellion, especially what's most likely one premeditated from the moment they surrendered, is something that cannot be tolerated, AZULA had helpfully relayed to the 11th's officers. Xing is treating this as treachery, and as such a message has to be delivered. Well, it was good to know that Xing was still Xing with his fondness for making examples. So with Kylan forcing him to stay in bed, AZULA had taken it upon herself to pick up Xing's work, as if she was already his wife. It was a sweet thing, if not for just how furiously focused the girl was. The other Earth Kingdom generals, they're cooperating? AZULA asked as they walked the massive hallways of the palace. Rin shrugged. For now, Yu and Sung are complying with the order to disarm their forces, though Yu especially is still pleading mercy for his men. Mercy or not, they cannot be trusted. The moment that idiot Fong pulled off that stunt, Ba Sing Se became an even greater liability to the Fire Nation. No doubt the courtiers back home would be hosting a party after hearing of this incident. Xing survived though, Rin pointed out. AZULA shook her head. That's not the point. The ambush just proved that the local manpower Xing was relying on is tainted and untrustworthy. Keeping them would make Xing look desperate. Removing them would severely cut down on our garrison, as you well know. For a city as large as Ba Sing Se, it'd be reasonable to expect that with a shrunken garrison the whole place could erupt into rebellion very soon. Xing's bold ideas would be proven ineffective, and his reputation would take a hit. Enough so for father to call off the engagement, if they exploit it properly. Fire Nation politics. So we just have to act fast and decisively, Rin said to shore up AZULA's confidence, though surprisingly it wasn't needed. No, it's just Xing who needs to get out of bed fast, the princess replied. Annoying as it is, he was right to keep the prisoners alive for now. Executing them would have been short-sighted of me. Rin couldn't help smirking. Of us, AZULA. Short-sighted of us. We were all ready to burn all of those scum to ash and turn them into ink blocks as souvenirs for their families. Thank Kylan and Prince Iroh for being the voices of reason, while Xing was still incapacitated. Strangely, Yama was on AZULA's side calling for mass burnings, though his rage was not as incandescent as the princess. The bastards are making it harder for everyone else in this mess city. His love for Ba Sing Se was definitely different from what Rin and the others had expected. You can't just do it on his behalf, Rin asked AZULA as they turned towards the gardens. The young princess snorted, smoke actually trailing from her nostrils as her caged anger grew hot again. It'd make Xing look weak. We're walking a fine edge, Rin. If I act on Xing's behalf too much, it'd make him look ineffectual and unsuitable for his title. Someone who managed to get his rank out of his connection with me, which was about how the nobles usually did things. But if he acts too boldly, they'd say he was trying to use me to gain power, that I'm being manipulated. AZULA growled out the last words, and this time Ren had to place a soothing hand on her shoulder to calm the girl down. Either way, Xing would be viewed unfavorably, and I'd be seen as being too young and emotionally compromised. I will stand for neither insult. Rightfully so, Rin agreed, and not for the first time wished that some problems could be easily solved by careful applications of daggers. They finally reached the gardens, and AZULA froze as she saw Ren's little surprise in the center of it. The captain smiled as the girl gave a questioning and mildly stunned look. Mosey agreed that this one had no further value to us, so I was allowed to borrow her until Xing needed her back. AZULA turned back to the garden's pavilion, inside which the small assassin that wounded Xing was bound to a stone ornament improvised as a stake. Her bruises had been healed by the waterbender healers, so the only sign of her ordeal was the sheer terror in her eyes. Rin would have requisitioned the assassin's friends as well, but apparently the wannabe theater actor with the hook blades had some rather juicy information, and the archer was being used as torture in proxy of sorts. I figured you could use some venting, so long as the assassin remains alive by the end of it. The princess then followed Ren's smug gaze around the garden, where several instructors stood guard, and then glanced back at the royal bodyguards shadowing the princess. I assume you can pretend that we're all just enjoying the flowers. For all their usual stoicism, they nodded as one, making AZULA break out into a grin. Thank you, Ren. You can have a go once I'm done. It's all right, AZULA, Ren answered laconically as she watched the little prisoner shake her gagged head in sheer terror at the princess stalking over towards her. Can't have you playing favorites with regimental officers, after all. Blue flames erupted from AZULA's hands, and Ren was treated to a masterful display of precision fire bending from the crown princess. She only had to intervene 4 times to stop AZULA from really breaking her loaned gift. The results shouldn't have been surprising, but Iroh still found himself appalled at the way the prisoners were dealt with after their failed insurgency. The 11th were a close-knit regiment after all, so the losses they took, however few that might be, were still taken almost personally. And besides, their beloved leader had been brought low by an assassin's poison. Such a callous reaction should be expected, but to be taken to such an extreme felt excessive. Out of consideration for being outnumbered, the 11th had broken every prisoner's limbs and locked them in rooms like mistreated barnyard animals for convenience's sake. Iroh had seen the troughs filled with slop and water being carried over to feed them, and imagined the mutilated men crawling over the troughs like mussos. The prince also heard the screams from the tortured officers as they were interrogated. It was a terrifying feat that the soldiers of the 11th could wrench out such screams from General Fong's usually steely demeanor. Even with the torture sessions being carried out in one wing, the stench of blood and shit and terror reeked throughout the whole palace complex. Men and women made dark jokes about what they managed to make their victims endure over their meals, or complained about their victims so rudely sullying their clothes with blood and viscera as if it were a minor hazard during a chore. That AZULA gave her regiment a free hand was one thing, but Xing too did not try to stop them as Iroh had thought he might once he woke up. It was a horrifying glimpse into an infamous fighting force having their leashes loosened, at getting permission to reveal their true, bloodthirsty selves. Worst of all, for all his dread, Iroh had no right to stop the bloody madness. AZULA had labeled the prisoners as rebels rather than prisoners of war, which meant no courtesies were considered for their well-being. After its own warlord era and the bloody unification that followed, the Fire Nation was far less tolerant of treachery within its own ranks than when facing the hostility of an enemy. So the crime of insurrection was similarly given a far harsher penalty that practically rescinded every right a person had. Xing managed to somehow reduce them even further by decreeing that the insurgents were operating on a false surrender, as General Fong clearly had planned for the attack when he bent the knee to Xing. As a retired prince, Iroh had no right in interfering in such affairs when the two teens were taking the appropriate measures, according to Fire Nation sensibilities. The prince still remembered the whispered tales of his grandfather Sozin ruthlessly crushing any protests against his campaign to conquer the Earth Kingdom continent. Those stories tried to paint the mass public executions as being brutal, but now, seeing the fate of these prisoners locked away, Iroh began to understand that death, however agonizing as it might be, could be seen as a sweet mercy. Iroh regretted appealing to his niece to spare the prisoners from swift execution, rather than damning them to a worse fate. But Iroh also knew that on paper, what the prisoners were undergoing now might be construed as being lax and indulgent for letting them live at all. After all, the 11th had managed to practice extreme restraint by only venting their wrath on the very people that tried and failed to bring them down. The standard practice in the colonies before AZULA took over was to raze a town or village to the ground if anyone in it raised a hand against Fire Nation rule. Its people might be slaughtered or allowed to spread the tale, depending on the mood of the field commander at the time. Cities would theoretically be sacked before being fed to the fires, though up until a Mashin none have dared try. It was a sentiment still held by many in the courts of the home islands. So here in Ba Sing Se, where the insulted 11th were keeping its treacherous prisoners alive for more than 2 days now, and the city's populace were allowed to continue living their lives without so much as a random arrest out of suspicion, on paper, with the broad details reported in court, it'd make it look like Xing and AZULA were being immensely patient. Iroh suspected that even with the grisly details added in, some in court who saw themselves as jaded veterans might still make remarks about how the young couple were being too casual with the attempt on their lives, that heads should be rolling immediately instead. If only Iroh could capture all the carefully sown and harvested agony. If only he could bring everyone from the royal court, his brother included, over here to experience the ruthlessness by themselves. And that was not to mention the potential fates of those caught in the crossfire, the other Earth Kingdom armies in particular. Iroh sighed as he laid down his bowl of tea and faced the two remaining generals. General Yu looked resigned, while General Sung was utterly desperate. Is there not anything we can do to alleviate their concerns? The latter asked, not for the first time. The old prince sighed again as he shook his head ruefully. I have tried talking to my niece, but the crown princess is adamant. You will either relieve your forces of most of your armory, or you will be viewed as conspirators to the failed insurrection and be dealt with appropriately. You stared into his tea bowl for a moment before shaking his head. We have little choice then. The weary general looked to Iroh with his brittle composure clearly wavering. At least tell me, Prince Iroh, are we to be purged? At that last word, Sung went pale and slumped back into his seat. I honestly wish I could tell you, General. But neither my niece nor the young prince would inform me of what is to follow next. I see. Iroh tried to find and offer a silver lining. If it is of any consolation, I am sure that neither AZULA or Xing would seek to extend any punishment to family members. You took some heart in it. But Sung looked no better from hearing the words. General, you finally picked up his bowl of tea, but opted to stare into it with despair. Our problem wasn't whether we knew of Fong's treachery or not. It was how we acted when it happened. Unfortunately so, Iroh replied with a solemn nod. He could understand that turning your blade against your comrades, regardless of reasons, could make even the most stalwart warrior hesitate. Torn between their pledge to work with Xing and Fong's attempt to free the city, these generals and their men abstaining from the fighting was reasonable, from a certain perspective. Perhaps even Xing could see it. Unfortunately, public perception would not share such a view, and Xing and AZULA were nothing but careful about nurturing that for their own sakes. Still, I will ask Prince Xing to enlighten me, or to allow you generals to appeal to him once he recovers enough to leave his room, Iroh promised, however useless that offer was. However ruthless he has been honorable in his dealings as a commander thus far, so I have hope that he does not intend for you and your men's unjust demise. It is all we can hope for, you finally answered, and emptied his bowl of tea in a single gulp. Iroh easily forgave the general for his callous treatment of such an exquisite brew, and quietly refilled the bowl. These might be the last proper drinks these men had. It was best that they were allowed to enjoy this illusion of tranquility. Iroh was silently relieved, however disgraceful it was, that it wouldn't take long to find out what the general's fate would be. Knowing Xing, he'd want to resolve the Dai Li and the insurgent issues before the Avatar arrived. In hindsight, scampering through the forest at night might not have been the best idea, prime opportunity or not. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the now much smaller lights of the camp, and then fixed my gaze forwards once more to try and pick out the details of the forest the moonlight gave me. Sighing, I pushed aside my doubts and continued onwards. This might not be the best idea, but it was not the worst one either. I might not have the closest idea of where and when I am, but I knew enough to not be stuck in the villain's side. I'm just a scrawny kid with shit fire bending, and it'd suck to be brought into a new life, just to be dismissively deleted by the Avatar on his way to his adventures. I'll have to make my way south. Yeah, south was where Omashu and its crazy-eyed king was. And that island of warrior women too, I think. I'm just a kid now. I could probably convince them to let me join without having to worry about being a spy or anything. I hope. This was a world where teens beat out hardened fighters, after all. I'll have TI froze as I saw the flicker of light up ahead. Then sense returned, and I crouched down to actually hide. It was just one speck at first moving across my vision, but then more flitted after it, like a procession of fireflies. Procession? Wait, the Fire Nation soldiers said there were Earth Kingdom raiders. They're sort of the good guys, right? Should I try to approach them? But the town I was dug out from was obliterated by raiders. Would they welcome me, or just kill me on sight? Assuming these light bearers were from the Earth Kingdom in the first place, anyway, I should wait them out, let all of them pass by. But I crept after them anyway, because I was too curious, and the risk was better than being lost in a forest by myself right now. As I got closer, I could make out the sounds of countless footsteps and the shuffling of equipment. Thankfully, this small body, even as bruised as it was good at climbing, so I had my first glimpse of what an Earth Kingdom fighting force actually looked like from the safety of the treetops. They looked nowhere near as clean as the show made them out to be. Lantern lights highlighted the mud and blood on their green armor and yellow garments beneath it. Their faces were just as unkempt as the Fire Nation soldiers I escaped from. And more noticeably, this procession gave off a sense of ugliness that the Fire Nation counterparts did not have. It was the kind of ugliness that I'd encourage my friends, especially non-existent female ones, to steer clear from. There was none of the discipline that the Fire Nation side had, either. Even I could tell that their sentries were lazily keeping watch, and they were shambling along with a reluctance and complacency that was beyond just being tired. These men were like recently glutted cats, all confident and uncaring after they had their fill. None of them so much as turned their head when I twisted off a twig from my branch and threw it towards another tree. I tried it a few more times, and the only time a soldier looked up was when a leaf fell onto his helmet. Feeling confident, I climbed back down the tree, instead of, doing something stupid like jumping from branch to branch, and kept to the shadows. There were a lot of soldiers passing by, and eventually what counted as their baggage train came into view. With my heart hammering and the deafening roar of blood rushing through my ears, I quickly dove in between the guards and plucked off a pouch hanging off a laden wagon. I did not trip, There was no arm shooting out to catch me. There was no sudden jolt of pain from a spear. I actually reached the pouch and absconded with it back into the shadows without a hitch. The Earth Kingdom soldiers didn't react at all, their heads still scanning about idly. Giddy from my undeserving success, I peered down into the pouch and was even more elated to find it contained dried meat. I was half expecting currency or wares to be able to trade off for when I reached a settlement. But having food meant I could shave off the desperation that I just now realized I'd be in if I didn't find anyone to trade with for too long. Coins don't help much when you're starving in the woods, after all. I glanced back to the procession marching into the darkness. Maybe I should stick close by and try bagging a few more useful items before I continued on my travels. It wasn't too hard to shadow the Earth Kingdom force. I stuck to sleeping on a particularly thick tree branch nearby their camp to avoid being stepped on by a patrol or something. Looking back, it was a stupidly risky move, but at the moment, especially buoyed by my earlier success, I felt safe enough with how lax their security was. I kept watching them from my perch as I snacked on jerky, noting how much more unruly these soldiers truly were compared to my previous. Well, the Fire Nation bunch weren't captors exactly. Just ill-suited caretakers, maybe? It didn't matter. I have no idea just how bad the Fire Nation was, just as how I didn't know how good the Earth Kingdom was, especially with the Omni-sensei episodes. Best to not get accidentally involved in a group of baby-eating loonies, and head straight for the people I know are certifiably goody-goody. If I can run into the Avatar and his gang, all the better. To arms! To arms! A bunch of soldiers running back and yelling stirred up the Earth Kingdom camp from their morning days, breaking me out of my idle thoughts. Enemy incoming. In an instant, the soldiers shed their laziness from the night before, and their movements became sharp and decisive. There was a chaotic jumble of shouting as men hurriedly donned their armor and grabbed their weapons. In just a few minutes, what looked like a whole tent city was emptied out, and the soldiers assembled to the barking orders of their superiors. Just like that, what looked like a bunch of hooligans turned into formation of professional soldiers, who began moving in formation like they were a single organism. It looked and sounded far more impressive than in the movies, that's for sure. As they headed off, I climbed down my treetop perch and headed for their now abandoned camp. Well, not exactly abandoned, as I almost fatally discovered by stopping just short of running into a grumbling sentry. The man didn't notice me and seemed to be annoyed at being left behind. Thankfully, he was too busy complaining of being stuck at guard duty to notice me, so I slipped in to do some quick looting. From the first tent I entered, I picked up a knife that looked like a short sword in my small hands. From the others, I found coin pouches and personal rations. Considering my body's limits, I took the smallest of the latter and carefully sifted through the latter for just enough provisions that I could carry. No water skins or anything like that yet, unfortunately. Maybe it'll be in the big tent where they serve their food, or I'll have to rely on finding rivers and such. Now that I think about it, how safe is the water in this world? I'm not shitting myself to death from the Fire Nation's servings, so I guess it shouldn't be too bad. I was sneaking into a slightly bigger tent when I heard the muffled sounds of rumbling and fire roaring. The fighting was getting closer, or it was just getting started. I dove into the tent and held my breath as I listened to the clamor for a better idea. It was the latter, I realized after several seconds of straining my ears. The noise wasn't getting closer, though it spiked loudly on occasion with explosions. I imagined the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation soldiers facing off against one another, and imagined how much bloodier actual live combat would be compared to the cartoon. It'd be one hell of a mess for sure. Then the smiling faces of those Fire Nation soldiers that fussed over me flashed through my mind, especially that old man's. No, best not get too involved. I've got to get out of here quickly. Ignoring the contents of this tent, I snuck out and made my way out of the camp. The wind carried the stench of smoke to my nostrils, and I couldn't help myself from turning to see the wisps of smoke snaking up from the tree line. Again, I pictured those smiling faces. I shouldn't be too worried. The Fire Nation was the big bad of the show, so until the Avatar appeared, they'll likely be winning this fight and trampling over their Earth Kingdom opponents. Right? Maybe I could sneak up and see how the fighting was going. At least I'll have an idea of where to run once the fighting was concluded. This time, I stuck to the treetops, the added weight of my loot barely adding to how anxious I felt as I leapt from branch to branch and surprised myself by not crashing onto the ground each time. For a young kid, this body was very responsive and sure of itself. I came to the edges of the fighting in no time, and a coldness took me as I saw actual warfare for the first time in all its gory glory. There were armored forms crushed between boulders, spilling out bright pink meat from their mouths. Some people were running about with horrific wails as their bodies were lit aflame. My mind imagined the slow gurgle soldiers made as their opponents slowly drove blades and spears into their guts. Adding to the sights and sounds, the smell was horrific. Shit and blood and burning tainted my sense of smell and made the air barely breathable. The same nausea I felt from when I saw those execution videos in my past life almost overtook me here. But this time I did not swoon, because a big part of me reminded the rest of myself that I was in a particularly dangerous environment. Puking now would give me away. I was about to turn and leave, but then I caught sight of a particular group of Fire Nation soldiers. That old man was fighting, throwing fire to send several spearmen screaming as they burnt to death. Those soldiers protecting him were also doing a bloody job of hacking and burning away at the opposition. Yet it was clear that they were outnumbered and would soon be overrun. Come to think of it, I glanced about the battlefield and looked beyond the gore and horror. Contrary to my expectations, the Earth Kingdom was actually outnumbering the Fire Nation here, and it was becoming clear that the latter was going to lose. The red armored troops were fighting in tight groups, but every now and then one of their number would fall to mass spears or get pasted by a flying rock. My head turned back to the old man who fought with a vigor and ferocity of someone more than half his age. Even from afar, I could make out the grim determination on his wrinkled features, a determination that was shared by his soldiers fighting for their lives. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the sight. He barked out orders as he enveloped an earthbender with a blast of fire, and I felt goosebumps again at the familiar voice. This is another world, I forcefully reminded myself, though my body still wouldn't move. This is another world. These are different people. That colonel is not Gramps. Gramps was dead long ago. They don't have the same wrinkles, don't even have the same demeanor. But then I remembered his warm smile. Remembered how I almost mistook him for my grandfather the first time we met. The colonel was more soft-spoken and reserved, but his eyes held the same kindness, same gentleness of my late old man. They were practically alike in spirit. Shame fell on me like a heavy cloak as I realized I was about to watch my grandfather's doppelganger get killed. Worse, I just realized that I had leapt off the tree and was landing onto a gaggle of Earth Kingdom soldiers. My hand went for the knife before my panicking mind remembered about it, and its tip sank into the neck of a soldier as I landed among them. Xing! I heard a familiar woman's voice called out worriedly, but pushed it aside as I stared up at a group of angry, scowling faces. Shit! I lost my knife. A spear lunged, and I immediately leapt back, and I did my best to redirect my energy into figuring out my next steps instead of simply shitting myself in terror. My chest bubbled with barely contained terror at the stupidity of my actions. I ducked a spear shaft swatting at me, and then strained myself as I twisted to avoid several thrusts. Some of the green-armored men roared, and I yelled back at them. And then I had to close my eyes as white fire blasted out of my mouth. The blinding light was over in a second as surprise took over me. And when I opened my eyes again, there was a gap in the formation of men. I blinked as I looked to the stumps of legs that were all that was left of my enemies, and then looked to the remaining surprised soldiers. So maybe it wasn't just terror then. Get the boy. This time, I quickly ran towards my attackers instead of trying to avoid them, and I frantically called up that bubbling in my chest again. It took way too long for my liking, and I barely avoided being skewered a couple of times before I felt that familiar tingling. I willed that churning sensation through my arms as I finally dove for one man's feet. And this time there was an incredible rush of something moving through me as white fire burst out of my palms and removed the man's thighs. His screams were cut short as he tumbled down into my flames. An angry roar sent me leaping aside with no time to appreciate the burning ache in my arms. I kept dodging and staying alive somehow, and at some point I stopped thinking too much. Everything was simplified to simple directives. I wielded fire, and these men burned. Stay alive and burn the green people. I slid between two green-armored soldiers, igniting my flames as my palms grazed their sides. They fell as I rose up. Then I ran and leapt towards a man who had just lifted his spear out of a Fire Nation soldier. Could I redirect the energy through my legs? My puny foot kicked out the charred remains of his shin. Yes, I can. Aches just as badly as my arms, though. Then I shot a knee up to meet his falling chin. And then his face became a blackened crust. It ached a bit more, but I didn't have to release the fire at the ends of my limbs. Useful. My hands shot out to burn away a rock as big as I was. I opened my eyes too quickly. There was still smoke and debris obscuring my view. Wait, I shouldn't wait to get a clear picture. There's still fighting all around. Stupid. I dove through the smoke and found the earthbender staring blankly at me. I had initiative, so seize it. I lunged to place a palm on his chest and then moved again. No point in watching him fall. He'll be dead with a hole in his chest. My arms and legs began to hurt as I kept moving and burning. My chest didn't hurt as bad, but making my lungs move was taking more effort. Was I sweating? No, it's blood. Someone else's, because I can't be bleeding that much and still be moving. A Fire Nation soldier stopped an Earth Kingdom one from pouncing on me as I checked myself for wounds. That was stupid of me. I need to keep moving. I repaid the gesture by screaming fire into a group of Earth Kingdom soldiers, because my arms and legs were feeling sore. It was a mistake. Now my throat's aching badly, and my lungs are actually feeling some pain. Another stupid mistake. But I can't stop yet. Stay alive and burn the green people. I tried to pick up a fallen sword, but it was too heavy, so I settled instead for a broken spear tip. A bit unwieldy, but enough for me to avoid my next attacker and bury the metal into his groin. Gotta remember, the weak points are their joints. Aim for the joints with metal. And I did find more metal. I used 4 daggers, and the strain to push them into meat was far better than the ache of using fire. I still had to burn, though, even if my arms shook for some reason. Even if I was breathing out smoke. No, not smoke, cold mist. It was hard to find daggers. Why was I breathing out cold air? Because I'm getting cold. My chest was hurting more. My body was shaking. Why, though? I didn't know, but there were still green people. Stay alive and burn the green people. I moved to reach for one of them that was looking at me with hands raised. This time, someone stopped me. I turned to shrug off a heavy hand on my shoulder and saw his eyes boring into me. That's enough, Xing. My name's not Xing. But Gramps still had that same warm, deep smile. The smile from when he still remembered who I was. They've surrendered, Xing. You can stop now. Surrendered? I turned to the remaining Green Earth Kingdom men. And yes, they were on their knees. No weapons on them. No need to burn anymore. I'm glad you came back, Gramps said, just as devoid of anger or disappointment as the first time I tried to run away. Just relief. Just glad that I stood before him again. We thought you had run off. I gave him the same answer I did the first time. I didn't have anywhere to go. Like before, Gramps gave the same, warm smile, the kind that made it worth my parents' scolding and punishments. Then the cold caught up with me, and I couldn't burn it away. Someone caught me as I fell, and I felt ashamed as I saw Gramps becoming worried right before the darkness took me. The Kyoshi warriors poorly hid their nervousness as they assembled in what was once one of the palace's more extravagant guest halls. Now the room was completely bare, with all furniture and even the torches and braziers removed. The shafts of natural sunlight piercing through the many windows and highlighting the beautiful mosaic floor gave the empty hall an eerie air. Or it would have, if not for the crowd of kneeling and gagged prisoners taking up most of the floor space, arranged in rows. It probably didn't help the mood to have the grim faces of Xing, AZULA, and some of their soldiers standing beside Suki and her warrior sisters and staring down at the captured Dai Li. While Xing's expression was unreadable, the princess and some of the soldiers were clearly repulsed by the kneeling men and were keen on burning them all away. Xing's words told Suki why the prisoners were here at all. These men were the staff we captured under Lake Laogai. That immediately grabbed the Kyoshi warriors' attention. Suki stared at the prince, and then the prisoners, feeling something bubbling in her. Do you think you can identify your torturers? The Kyoshi warriors snarled as one, and Suki answered for them. Easily. They fanned out among the whimpering men, and Suki found herself spitefully enjoying their broken states. The digit-less stumps of their hands and feet were twisted at unnatural angles, and the emblem of the old boss Sing Se was branded on their chests and backs. She stalked across one row, and then stopped to kneel down in front of a particular man who was doing a bad job at turning his head away from her gaze. This one, Suki declared vindicatively. He was the one who tried to. She paused and drew in a slow breath to steady her will. He was the one who tried to rape me in front of the others. The former torturer mewed pathetically as a soldier from the 11th came to Suki's side and roughly dragged the Dai Li out. She could hear the dark glee in Miyu's voice suddenly calling out. "Here's one. He was the one who tore out our nails and broke our fingers. This one too," Okuni added a few rows down. The Kyoshi warriors carefully went through the rows of Dai Li prisoners, and the Scorpion's people helpfully yanked out the whimpering men each time. Xing was gracious enough to let them do a second pass before they finally confirmed that they had identified all their torturers. "Thank you for taking the time and not just declaring all of them as guilty," he said with a thin smile that made the lingering black veins on his left cheek ripple. Beside him, AZULA grinned proudly for some reason, and behind them, a couple of soldiers were begrudgingly passing pouches to their fellows. Xing gave a nod that sent his men and women out to unkindly usher out the unselected prisoners. It did well for Suki's spirits to see the once dark and powerful Dai Li broken into little more than a groaning, weeping men as they were herded out of the hall. She exchanged smirks of grim satisfaction with the others, and found herself eagerly looking forward to what was going to happen next with the 24 or so tormentors the Kyoshi warriors had singled out. This time, it was AZULA who turned to address the Kyoshi warriors, with all the authority of her royal rank. Surprisingly, the princess bowed formally, with all traces of her usual smirk of superiority hidden. The Earth Kingdom might be the Fire Nation's enemies, but even we did not expect them to stoop so low. As Crown Princess of the Fire Nation, allow me to offer my sincere sympathies for what your supposed allies had done to you. Know that I do not expect this to immediately change your perception of us, or that we might now be seen as your friends. We do this because we too see the dire need for justice for such a foul crime." Suki did not flinch when the remaining soldiers around her drew their weapons. Contrasting starkly to AZULA's formality, Xing kept a casual tone and posture as he gestured to his troops. "Would you rather choose and watch the execution of these Dai Li, or would you prefer dealing with it yourselves?" It was a pointless question, but one that Suki nonetheless appreciated. The Fire Nation overlords of Ba Sing Se left the hall after the Kyoshi warriors were equipped with swords, leaving only a quartet of guards to stand outside the hall's entrance. "Call on them once you're done," Xing said laconically, ignoring the increased whimpering and squirming from the Dai Li. "I hope this is a significant step towards attaining closure for all of you. I'll have a bath prepared for you," AZULA added offhandedly, "and new clothes. So don't worry about being too messy." Suki led the other Kyoshi warriors in bowing out of sincere gratitude and respect to their hosts. "Thank you for saving us and allowing us this." "Don't overdo it," the princess simply replied. "I'd hate to see you all sprain a muscle or something." They waited until the young royals had left the hall with their guards and soldiers, and then turned to the crippled prisoners with dark intent. The Kyoshi warriors stalked towards their former abusers with snarls and grins, and as they brought their loaned blades to bear with practiced ease, Suki basked in the terror of these broken men before her. The Dai Li's pitiful screams and the carnage that was enacted on them were a salve that the Kyoshi warriors greatly needed, and Suki found herself appreciating AZULA's gesture. A bath and new clothes greatly helped after bloodily facing down her nightmares. "People of Ba Sing Se," Kai announced loudly in one of the larger squares in the lower ring to draw in the apprehensive populace around him. Despite being thick in the midst of the conquered people with only a squad and a couple of transport tanks, Kai didn't feel too concerned for his safety, as was interrupted so rudely days before by terrorists. Prince Xing wishes to announce the condition of the Dai Li victims. That confirmed the attention of more than a significant chunk of the crowd, and Kai could sense trepidation giving in to curiosity and hope. He gave it a few seconds for some people to desperately push their way to the front of the crowd for a better listen. It is the prince's pleasure to declare that a solution has been found to reverse the damage to the victims of Lake Laogai. Thanks to the aid of waterbender healers, your loved ones will be returned to you shortly. Kai had to consciously make an effort not to grin as he saw the ripple of relief sweep across the city square. He glanced at a trooper and gave a silent order with a nod of his head before returning to the speech. The healing process is slow, thanks to the insidious methods of the Dai Li, but as proof of Prince Xing and the Fire Nation's progress, we come today with those women successfully liberated from the Dai Li's cruel mind slaving. The crowd rose to a deafening murmur as the squad protectively led out a quartet of skittish young women. It took Kylan and her people a lot of time figuring out how to deal with the long-lasting scars of the Dai Li's conditioning, and these women would still need some time and care to be reintegrated into society, which was why Xing had made sure that the women being freed all had families to return to. For those that they couldn't find any trace of a relative or loved one, they were kept in the palace for the time being. Kai watched as the women huddled together beside him, and kept an eye out to the crowd as he kindly addressed them. Please, announce yourselves so that your family can be sure that it's you. Me, Miao Qing of Lusha Village, the first woman said, and Kai had to make her repeat her name louder before a trembling couple forced their way to the front. She immediately noticed them, and the soldiers did not stop her as she began walking towards them. Mom, Dad, a heartwarming scene ensued, of a lost daughter being united with her worried parents. Kai found it hard to push down a smile, but he had work to do. You next, ma'am, he said to the next woman, who looked at the sobbing and hugging trio, and drew strength from it as she announced her name. Hiyori of Lotus Pond District, she called out desperately. How convenient that said district was where they were right now. At least the Daili had the decency to record the addresses of their victims. This time, a man stormed to the front, hands in butcher's apron glistening with fresh blood. The woman Hiyori didn't seem to mind, running straight for the butcher who caught her in his arms. I thought you ran off. I thought you hated me, he cried out as they both broke quickly down. Kai and his men had the pleasure of witnessing more touching scenes of reunited spouses and families. By the end of it, with no more women to return, the crowd fixed their now hopeful gaze at the captain. These ladies will be the first of many. Be assured that the Fire Nation will return your partners, sisters and daughters back to you as soon as they are healed. Prince Xing is eager to do what he can to undo the damage wrought by your previous rulers, and is committed to freeing all of the Dai Li's victims from their shackled minds. Damn it, his audience was taking in the words too well. Heads were bobbing, and optimistic smiles could be seen. Looks like he'll have to requisition for a house in the Eastern District. Freaking run and her sunrises. Pushing aside his annoyance, Kai gave another nod to his men, and then braced himself for the next part of the performance. The men roughly herded out of the other transport tank a group of whimpering and crippled men, each naked save for a simple green loincloth and a gag, each sporting the emblem of Ba Sing Se branded onto their backs and chests. He had the crowd hanging on to his every word by now. Even the reunited families were looking at him intently as he drew out another scroll. As further proof of his commitment to justice, Prince Xing has also seen fit to allow the wronged citizens of Ba Sing Se to dispense justice, as they see fit to the Dai Li. Knowing their parts, the squad of soldiers kicked some of the Dai Li towards the crowd. As such, all Dai Li in captivity are, as of right now, being handed over to the people of Ba Sing Se. Only Long Feng, the leader of the Dai Li, will be retained by Prince Xing to personally enact his own brand of punishment on behalf of the Avatar and Ba Sing Se. Kai and his squad took several steps back towards the tanks, and they watched as the crowd shifted their attention to the branded men before them. The silence was thick and anxious, until the girl from Lusha Village, Miao Qing, broke from her parents' embrace and rose to her feet. She stomped over to the Dai Li still pleading through their gags and launched a savage, if poorly executed, kick across one's face. Bastards! You made me, she shrieked as she launched another kick on her victim, and then settled for stomping him into the ground. Her parents joined her soon enough, screaming curses as they pummeled the poor sod into a pulp. That was the spark that the crowd needed, and cries of outrage filled the air as the mob descended on the Dai Li. Always good to see a happy ending, Kai said dryly before ordering his men back to the tanks. Similar scenes were being repeated elsewhere in Ba Sing Se. The 11th were stretched thin because of it, but at least it was only for a day. There were just enough liberated brainwash victims and Dai Li to apportion to all the squares throughout the massive city-state, just as Xing wanted. Kai found it interesting that he wanted to deal with General Fong and the other insurgents separately, instead of lumping them together with the Dai Li. Knowing Xing, it was probably to give himself enough prisoners to make a scene with. Right, we'll go back and rest up, and then it's over to the middle ring for round 2, Kai told his team, before enjoying the rather peaceful drive back to the palace. With the lower ring allowed their vengeful bloodlust, traffic should be light for the next, say, hour or so. Zuko found his time with Mai's family to be a mixed bag. On the one hand, Mai's mother, Michi, was very welcoming, and it was a little bittersweet to see how she doted on Mai. Michi was a good, caring mother who managed to balance her, annoying in Mai's eyes. love for both her children. Quite unlike how Zuko and AZULA were given affection, he quietly noted. It always took some effort in quashing the pang of missing his own mother, and the disgraced prince often winded up staring blankly at Mai's and Michi's interactions as he wondered where his mother had fled to and why. Still, the idle melancholy wasn't that bad a price. While Mai complained about being bored, Zuko often had the pleasure of watching her slowly stretch on her bed while she whined before him in the privacy of her room. She most definitely knew he was looking, judging from how she smirked as she displayed herself. On the other hand, Mai's father was rather persistent in treating Zuko like the prince he was not. The former governor would find or make the time to praise Zuko for serving so humbly in the military, or go on about how grateful Mai should be for having a prince watch over her. It came to a point where Michi had to drag Akano away right after dinner to give Zuko some space, which had the rather nice side effect of leaving him and Mai with more alone time. You know, if you weren't just standing there, we could be far less bored, Mai had outright said one day. My parents are out tom-toms with them, so... For some reason, Zuko's mind won over his lower head. It wouldn't be right, Lady Mai. Mai huffed as she got up from her bed to walk towards him. We're alone, Zuko. You can call me Mai. Try it. Zuko gulped, but managed to shake his head. I'd rather not insult you like that, ma'am. He flinched when Mai gave an ineffective punch into his armored stomach before whipping around to return to her bed. You're still too stuck up, Zuko. Yes, Lady Mai. Ugh. It wasn't that he didn't want to take her up on her invitation, but a certain fear effectively held him back. A fear that manifested in Zuko's mind in the form of his sister's glare. The constant reminder that Mai was AZULA's friend, and the little warning AZULA gave about making her an aunt had stuck deeply inside the prince, popping up every time he felt too tempted. Still, Mai didn't take it any further than Zuko was willing to either, so both of them settled for just viewing each other. It was an awkward compromise, but both parties were content enough to settle for it. Better than being caught by Akano, that's for sure. Things took a surprising turn, though, when Akano asked for the whole family to move to the docks one evening. While curious, neither Zuko nor Mai questioned it and followed along, and found themselves boarding a Fire Nation warship. Michi seemed as confused as the teens, but she maintained her noble bearing and kept silent as well as she carried Tom Tom. Alarm bells rang in Zuko's head when he recognized High Generals Bujing and Shina greeting Akano, and there was no mistaking that two of them glanced briefly at him as they whispered with the former governor. The unease spread further as Akano asked his wife to remain on the top deck, while asking for Mai, and by extension Zuko, to follow him to the bridge. Zuko was worried that Akano was about to trade off his daughter as a hostage against AZULA for some security of his station, or that they'd be suddenly announcing Mai's engagement to some noble family to spite him and AZULA, or Zuko himself would get ambushed to settle some grievances he was not aware about. He had not expected to meet his father on the bridge. Training was the only thing that made Zuko kneel and bow his head faster than Mai, as his mind reeled from the surprise. Fire Lord. Zuko. His father's voice was still as heavy with judgment, but carried far less disdain than Zuko remembered. It is good to see you again, my son. The conscripted prince remained silent simply because he couldn't get his mind to string sentences at the moment. Look at me. Zuko raised his head to stare straight into his father's harsh gaze, and found the same disappointment in them. Though it wasn't directed at him, how is your service as a foot soldier? It took several seconds of gaping like a fish out of water before Zuko managed to reply. Gee, good. It's, good, your highness. The glare became heavier, and Zuko swore he could feel the weight of it starting to drive him down onto the metal floor. We're told that you've been a competent warrior. Dutiful. I'm flattered by your praise, your highness. Enough. You may address me as your father, as is right. The disdain and annoyance in the words were sharp. Zuko gulped before nodding. As you say, father. Good. Now, Zuko. It has occurred to me that I have been lax in my attention to you. Negligent. Harsh. Before Zuko could come up with false assurances otherwise, the Fire Lord raised a hand to stall him, his glare still heavy and oppressive. It suddenly lifted, and a thin smirk appeared on the Fire Lord's face. With that realization in mind, I have come to make amends, though it would require work on your part. Zuko stared mutely as his father extended a hand towards him, while the other gestured out the bridge's windows. I've come to personally offer you a chance to undo your exile and all that comes with it, and return to my side as crown prince. Would you be interested in such an offer, my son? It was AZULA's last day in Ba Sing Se. Her duty as colonial minister could not be put off any further, no matter how good it was to share a bed with Xing for so many nights. As annoyed as she felt, the princess consoled herself knowing that she'd be back here again in a few months' time. She'll be missing the Avatar's arrival, but that bit was for the best, considering the optics of such a meeting. Xing had enough to deal with trying to hide his schemes from unwanted eyes. Having AZULA around would only draw further unneeded attention to the necessary but unapproved good he had planned. As a small consolation for missing out on the potential fun, AZULA sat in the shade, ringed by her bodyguards and 11th Honor Guards as she overlooked the largest plaza just outside of the palace. Not wanting a repeat of the surprise attack, the 11th Royal Regiment had already nearby buildings swept clean, and the tanks were out in full force this time. Xing stood in the middle of the plaza, the fearful but intrigued crowd keeping to the borders of the square by the rest of the regiment. With him was the broken form of Long Feng, kept up on his knees only by Xing grabbing onto his collar. After yesterday's public lynchings throughout the city, it was time to put a cap to the whole Dai Li affair. They'd squeezed out everything of value from Long Feng, from his organization's recruitment and asset ledgers, and the list of compromised nobles throughout the Earth Kingdom states. Scribes were already making copies of the latter for dissemination, to hopefully ruin the Earth Kingdom's morale further. Beyond the wealth of information he provided, Long Feng was of no further use. Like the rest of the Dai Li, they simply could not be trusted, and the nature of Xing's capture of Ba Sing Se meant that Long Feng automatically became a symbol of the old, despised regime, a symbol that had to be burned away. Xing gave no speech, merely making a show of sweeping his gaze across the crowd kept at a distance. Then he grabbed Long Feng by the shoulders, forcing the man onto his shattered knees. Even from where she sat, AZULA could see the leader of the Dai Li shaking his head desperately and pleading in some way or another for Xing to spare him. She idly wondered what angle he was using this time. AZULA had read the transcripts from the interrogations. Long Feng was very creative with begging and bargaining for his life. Maybe he's promising some last-minute information, or making up new stories about King K's non-existent siblings. General Yama checked on that one thoroughly. Apparently K's father did spawn some bastards, but the Dai Li had conveniently disposed of them years ago to cement K's reign. Regardless, Xing wasn't swayed, and the new prince of Ba Sing Se opened his mouth. AZULA could barely see the wisps of smoke escaping from his maw before she had to turn away as a blinding burst of white fire tore through Long Feng. It took barely a couple of seconds, and after annoyingly blinking away the afterimages, AZULA found her prince holding onto two cauterized near halves of the former Dai Li head. Long Feng's head and everything directly below it, right down to his groin, was burnt away. A small pile of ash collected on the smoking and glowing crater beneath the bisected corpse. Xing raised up both pieces of his victim like a prize fighter showing his winnings. "By my flames, Long Feng is dead," he finally declared. "The head of the Dai Li is no more, and along with the justice meted out by the citizens of Ba Sing Se, the Dai Li have been purged from Ba Sing Se." It still surprised AZULA that the claim was practically true. As far as the exhaustive ledgers and missives were concerned, the only Dai Li left were those beyond the city, sent to infiltrate and observe Ba Sing Se's vassals. Long Feng's little plan to gather his organization's whole strength to either repulse or impress Xing had allowed for the near-total capture of every detestable member. Not so surprisingly, after some silence at Xing's declaration, AZULA heard muted cheers break out among the crowd. Of course, it started from the liberated victims of Lake Laogai and their families. They were scattered at first, but then the cheering grew and merged into a single cohesive applause. Damn K and Long Feng. Damn the Dai Li and Earth Kingdom. AZULA didn't expect that level of resentment. But then again, considering that the crowd were mostly made up of the people from the middle and lower rings, it made sense. The middle and lower classes of Ba Sing Se had felt the significant effects of Xing's gentler hand, especially with how many restrictions he had removed from the old regime. The movement of people into the abandoned noble housing would drain away the overpopulation from the slums in the lower ring, while goods could now be freely traded instead of being regulated and hoarded by the Dai Li. It was goodwill that didn't take as much effort to cultivate compared to the conquered northern territories. If Long Feng had even some modicum of competence, he'd try to instill as much love for his puppet regime instead of relying purely on fear to prop his rule up. With hindsight, the princess understood that the whole shadowy policing force was but one possible option in maintaining one's rule, and it was an impractical one at that in the long term. It needed a counterbalance, a carrot to the stick. Fortunately for her, the colonies were orderly enough to not require exploring that avenue anytime soon. The diary would serve as an important note on what not to do. But for now, AZULA was content to sit back and enjoy seeing her fiancé being lavished with praise. It wouldn't last after all. Xing eventually got the crowd to calm down after tossing aside the remains of Long Feng. AZULA gripped her seat's armrests as she subconsciously braced herself for the ugly part of this whole show. The crowd's mood plummeted when General Feng and his accomplices were led out, all chained together and dragging themselves on swollen and badly healed legs. As expected, nearly the entirety of Feng's army were part of the insurgency, but it was only the largest part of it. The rest were comprised from some of the remaining nobles and their retainers, as well as some refugees lured from the lower ring. Like that girl that dared wound her Xing, AZULA was glad that Xing had granted her the privilege of incinerating that assassin and her friends. Other than the concerns of negative impressions from publicly executing refugees, AZULA enjoyed the instant gratification of torching the little clique for their involvement in the surprise attack. The boy with the hook blades, according to several testimonies including his own, contributed the idea of sneaking blasting jelly in the abandoned residences. The bowman of the group had been the one to launch the arrows coated in blasting jelly. Their expressions of terror were brief, but enough to sate the princess' wrath as she personally burned them to ash. As many of you might know, days ago, one of your generals, General Feng, who had agreed to work with me in keeping your city's peace, turned on me. The prisoners were made to kneel behind Xing. He mustered his army to join in his mad plan, as well as conspired with various nobles for their knowledge of the inner ring. Good, no mention of the lower classes. AZULA hid a grin. If Xing could successfully villainize the Ba Sing Se nobility, he'd have an easier time claiming the holdings within the inner ring for his civil projects. The abandoned wealth he'd garner from them would also go a long way towards paying off the massive city-state's expenditure without resorting to raising taxes. Xing kept an even composure as he kept talking, unmoved by the worried expressions blooming among the crowd. It was likely that Feng's soldiers had family in there, after all. Whether or not General Feng conspired with the Dai Li or acted on his own impulse, it didn't matter, because now that notion will take root in the public's mind. The result remained the same. The restoration of the Dai Li's victims were put in danger, and the Dai Li themselves might have escaped. AZULA nodded firmly at the delivery. Whether or not people were aware of the rather ham-fisted emphasis was unimportant. Such folks in her experience tended to be rare among a mob. So long as Xing kept to the truth, however technically, the skeptics would have little to no influence on how public opinion was steered. As much as it pains me to do so, I have to punish not only General Feng, but those who followed him as well. The crowd understandably tensed, probably remembering Xing's fire breath just moments ago. Earth Kingdom laws demand that I not only execute these rebels, but purge 4 generations of their relatives as well. Fire Nation laws ask for similar justice to be meted out, and there was the sour, fearful mood bubbling among the spectators. The guards around AZULA shifted slightly, just in case things veered off the margins. However, Xing snapped, refocusing the crowd's attention away from their worries and onto him. The Fire Lord has been generous to grant me free hand in ruling this city. As such, it is within my rights to lighten the sentence. As such, I will only execute these men who stand behind me. Xing swept his gaze across the crowd. Does anyone wish me to do otherwise? Do I have to send my soldiers out to drag over the rebels' families? Obviously, nobody objected, not when Xing reframed the whole thing as a binary option. The majority of the populace can now ignorantly wash away their guilt by convincing themselves that Xing was being merciful, while those whose brothers and fathers were involved in the insurgency should be smart enough to shut up. Xing gave the silence a few seconds before he nodded to the troops. Orders were curtly barked out, and the soldiers gently pushed the crowd several steps away from the square, while the other infantry and tanks also cleared away. The prisoners were prodded towards the center of the square, with General Feng kneeling right behind Xing, who promptly turned towards him with a theatrical flourish. General Feng, for your insincere pledge, for your attempt at destabilizing my rule over this city and the containment of the Dai Li. I, Xing, Prince of Ba Sing Se on behalf of Fire Lord Ozai, hereby sentence you and your conspirators to death. Fong could only shake bodily, as his weakened state didn't allow him much beyond a rasp through his gag. Xing gave it a second, to make sure the crowd got a decent look at the scene, and then shot up into the skies with a burst of fire. AZULA craned her neck up to see the shrinking speck that was her fiancé hovering in the air for a moment, and then once more the princess had to snap her gaze away as a pillar of blinding white fire shot down towards the ground. The group of prisoners behind General Fong vanished under the retina-burning flame strike. Smoke quickly began to sizzle out from between the square's neat tiles, and then the ground gave way. Most of the square swallowed up by a massive, glowing void that was prepared by Yama and his earthbenders just the night before. Fong fell into the hole, flailing his broken limbs. Those prisoners that didn't immediately get claimed by the hole like him were dragged along by the fellows they were chained with. The luckier ones were thrown closer to Xing's column of fire and were instantly incinerated. AZULA heard brief but anguished screams of the unluckier ones as they fell into the pool of molten earth. Xing's fires went out after just 4 seconds, but the hole that swallowed the prisoners did not stop glowing. He landed at the edge closest to the crowd, and even through the churning flames and agonized screams, AZULA could hear her Xing's declaration. Let it be known that this is the extent of my mercy and patience. If it weren't for propriety and the public setting, AZULA would have been running to tackle her fiancé right now. Iroh could only sigh heavily as he witnessed Xing's execution. The boy had tailored the whole thing with AZULA's help to tip the approval of Ba Sing Se closer to his favor. While the old prince couldn't fully condone the theatrical violence being used, from a politician's standpoint, it was an artfully brutal performance. Xing had not only shown his willingness to crush any opposition, but also emphasized the restraint he was acting with. With further editing of the news as it was disseminated, the young prince would be seen as a stern but fair ruler. The people of Ba Sing Se now had their expectations of their new overlord lifted considerably, so long as Xing didn't veer too far into harsh tactics. It was the sort of display that, in hindsight, Iroh wished his father and grandfather had exercised a bit more. Spirits knows how many conquered towns the Fire Nation might still have under their control if they took a softer approach, and how many lives on both sides of the war that could have been saved. And Xing once more proved his almost mercurial extremes by deeming Generals Yu and Sung and their forces innocent. The Earth Kingdom collaborator armies were relegated down to enforcing peace throughout the middle and lower rings though, and they would operate with far lighter equipment as Xing had nearly every military material, short of clubs and the common spear, transferred to the 11th's care. Despite the not-so-public humiliation, both Yu and Sung agreed that being defanged was a small price to pay compared to the deaths of thousands of their men. Xing, for his part, needed peace in Ba Sing Se to enact the changes he had in mind. Ambitious changes that Iroh only reluctantly agreed with, considering the alternatives. The massive city-state required a stable foundation built on trust, patience, and goodwill for the social changes its new prince had in store for it. Iroh contributed towards that peace as well, quietly reaching out to the members of the White Lotus within the city to gain their assistance. He had Xing's approval to reveal some of the long-term goals, which would go a long way in assuring the members of the order. As he watched the Xing leave and the crowd disperse from the crater that used to be a city square, Iroh told himself to follow up on his contacts soon. The last thing anyone needed was for another insurgency to sprout while the Avatar was visiting, which might further strain his impressions of the Fire Nation, or force Xing to ruin that impression altogether. With the main issue of public tolerance dealt with, Mosey led several squads to join Xing down to a particular area in the middle ring. It was a residential zone placed right up against the walls separating the middle ring from the lower one. Nondescript in every way except that it was tucked in deep within a barrier of tightly packed civilian workshops. If not for the map pointing out the false buildings and hidden alleyways behind the industrial block, the colonel wouldn't have expected to find a whole town's worth of people there. Squeezing through the narrow lanes that often led back out to the main streets, Xing led the group to what was basically a village hidden within Ba Sing Se. Mosey saw children running about and shrieking happily, while their parents looked on and chatted amongst themselves. They were all dressed just like any other Ba Sing Se citizen of the lower classes, and their homes were just like any other in the city. But now that he knew what to look out for, there were signs that things were not completely as it seemed. The residents froze as they finally noticed the soldiers. It took a second before the adults quickly swooped in to pick up their children and hastily head back to their homes. Mosey felt the concern settle on these secluded folk and saw the unsubtle and familiar movements of villagers ready to put up a feudal fight. Of course, Xing noticed that as well. "Please, I merely wish to talk with all of you. I do not wish for any violence here." It took a few seconds before a group of aged men and women walked over, their postures caught between defiance and resignation. A particularly wrinkled man with an intense gaze spoke on their behalf, putting on a bow with every ounce of reluctance. "What can we do for you, O Prince?" Mosey could feel the veteran soldiers exchanging glances with one another, and if not for his rank and being at the front with Xing, he'd be joining in as well. It had been a long while since they encountered such insolence, way before the 11th became truly feared. Mosey ignored the wave of nostalgia and focused on the conversation that unfolded. "You do not need to feign deference, elders. I know of this village's pedigree." Despite their age, the old men and women tensed. Xing quickly raised his hands placatingly to forestall further escalation. There wasn't much other choice of approaching this matter, unfortunately. Using Yama or Kylin as representatives might taint first impressions with insincerity and distrust. While Prince Iroh was occupied with other tasks Xing had assigned and Crown Princess AZULA had already left for the colonies. With civilian engagements like these, Xing fell back to the 11th's preference of an open and honest meeting. Sungo and his scouts were hidden in nearby rooftops as well, just to further ensure that the meeting was survivable. "We are just a forgotten slum area, Your Highness." The old man spoke with no hint of sincerity. He was buying time, either for an ambush or for his people to flee. Brave people these. Xing sighed softly. "Please, I just wish for a peaceful conversation. I do not have any intention of endangering the village of Hidden Clouds." Unsurprisingly, the elders burst into motion at the mention of their home's name. With dexterity that had put many of the 11th's best warriors to shame, the men and women lunged forwards with angry war cries. They were terrifyingly fast, but Mosey and his task force had anticipated such a response, and they braced themselves and blasted out fire to weaken the incoming gale. Even then, the gaggle of old airbenders still projected enough force to nearly knock the soldiers off their feet. Planks and bricks of the buildings behind them creaked as the air slammed into them. "Death to the Fire Nation." As we planned, peaceful pacification, Xing called out as Koshi stepped in to stop two men thrusting knife hands at him, barely deflecting the blades of air that tore out neat chunks of the masonry far behind them. It was an order easier said than done. Even with foreknowledge of these people's history, Mosey was far from prepared for just how fast these old folks were. He and his men struggled to avoid the bursts of air sent at them, their tactics and stances specialized for dealing against earthbenders completely useless. It was impossible to get close to these people. They just shot into the air and continued to rain air blasts on the soldiers as they landed. Trying to trade fire for wind proved to be just as ineffective, as these elders kept running up the walls and soaring through the air, making it near impossible to pin them down with the limited force. The arrows and flames of Sungo's scouts did nothing at all despite the supposed element of surprise. The wrinkled and hunched men and women had a grizzled warrior's preternatural sense of awareness, and they just used their air bending to shunt themselves out of harm's way. The whole sorry exchange threatened to continue for longer, until Xing opted for the last resort. "Cover me." Mosey and the others immediately converged to protect their prince, abandoning the offensive completely and enduring the storm-like winds from every direction, dampening the worst of it with their flames. They didn't have to hold out for too long, and Xing gave the signal once he was ready. "Drop." The soldiers did so as one, dropping to the floor with their hands above their heads. Mosey felt the edges of the biting cold creeping through his armor, while the air visibly froze over as the dust kicked up from the encounter became frosted. The effects on the airbenders were far more telling, as they yelped in surprise and fell to the ground in shivering heaps. Mosey felt the air around him warm up as Xing focused his heat bending on the now incapacitated targets. Now that they were down, the colonel finally got to see the telltale blue tattoos of the air nomads peeking through smudged makeup. "What dash," an old woman exclaimed with a frosted breath. Xing looked apologetic even as he walked over and threatened them. "Please cease your resistance. or I'll be forced to either deepen the cold or reverse it significantly. Mosey noticed the faint wisps of smoke rising from the prince's feet. It was mildly surprising, because up until now Xing said he usually vented through his scalp. Maybe he was trying something new? The old benders glared defiantly at the young prince even as their bodies rattled. But a younger voice called out to snatch away everyone's attention. Stop! Xing didn't, of course, and Mosey didn't need to order his soldiers to ready themselves as another group of villagers came out of the houses. They were adults, though far less wrinkled than the incapacitated elders. Their children, then. A man led this new group, hands raised as he desperately pleaded with Xing, please, stop it. Don't kill them. I wasn't planning to, Xing said evenly, and the elders' shivering lessened a little. But I do not wish to return to fighting. There'll be no more fighting, I promise. Xing gave the man a glance, and then to the elders on the ground still staring daggers at the Fire Nation delegation. It took a few seconds before the old men and women nodded shakily. Minutes later, everyone was seated civilly along the streets. With the violence over with for now, Mosey left the talking to his prince while he quietly surveyed the area from where he stood. The Earth Kingdom engineers had been ingenious in their design of the village of hidden clouds. The way the homes were built and laid out, Mosey guessed that if he were to look down from the walls separating the middle and lower ring, the village probably blended in with the workshops that served as a facade on the ground level. What was more impressive was that the grandfather of the deposed King K had ordered this air nomad refuge quickly built and then expunged from most records. So thorough was his work that even the older Dai Li left not a hint of the hidden clouds to their inheritors. If Mosey read between the lines correctly, the old king had purged just about everyone involved in the project and forcibly migrated in new residents to occupy the main street. It was Xing's curiosity that had him order a small army of officials to piece together the puzzle of subtly inaccurate accounting, sudden rise in palace recruitment, and a rash of coincidental state-announced obituaries. And it was a work that would have gone nowhere if not for someone finding an innocuous scribble in some ledger that, according to Xing, unlocked a cascade of surprising discovery. The official story was that the old Earth King had failed to appeal for the air nomads to stay when they stopped by Ba-Sing-Se right after the Fire Nation's assaults. The airbending monks had all supposedly accepted the city's hospitality for a few nights at most before moving on to try and reclaim their temples. In truth, some air nomads remained behind. Those monks that were pregnant, the young novices, or the badly wounded. There were various reasons for an airbender to be forced to stay behind. And the Earth King had hid them, not purely out of the goodness of his heart, but because at the time when outrage against the Fire Nation swept through the Earth Kingdom, asking the air nomads to settle outside of Ba-Sing-Se might draw heavy disapproval from his vassals. Yet at the same time, the Earth King did not wish to make his city a target of the Fire Nation's might. Of course, there was probably a different excuse offered to the airbenders at the time. So the village of Hidden Clouds was conceived and built, a hidden sanctuary for the air nomads until the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe gathered their strength to push the Fire Nation back. Unfortunately, the old Earth King had died quite suddenly, before fully revealing his plans to King K's father and the new generation of Dai Li, who misunderstood his last words. Long Feng's predecessor quickly gave up on searching for whatever Hidden Clouds truly meant, and went to work on refining the horrors under Lake Laogai. A whole group of airbending refugees were left forgotten, until now, and judging by how nobody else knew about their existence, they seemed content to lay low. I only wish to know whether you wish to remain as you are, or if you have better accommodations in mind, Xing explained with heavy exasperation to his doubting audience. Yeah, right, the old spokesman spat out. You just want an excuse to clap us in chains and send us to the Fire Lord, eh? The young prince sighed heavily. No, I don't. Look, if I really wanted to win the Fire Lord's approval, I would have just razed this place to the ground instead of wasting my time trying to talk to you, and then send him whatever tattooed remains are left. The elders seemed ready to argue again, but the younger adults, a bunch of which seemed still older than Mosey by a few years at least, stepped in. Then what are your intentions? The man from earlier asked. Why are you here? Because I do not wish to be responsible for snuffing the last of the air nomads. The Avatar accepted, of course. And you want us to believe that you'll actually do that? Let us be, an elder cut in derisively. We might be hidden here, but we're not blind nor deaf to the outside world, she added, jabbing a finger at Xing. "We know you, Scorpion. You'll have us wrapped up as a present to make your royal girlfriend happy." "No," Xing denied again, with more force this time. "Understand, just by me coming out here to talk, I am risking the Fire Lord's disapproval if he finds out. I am here to see that you and your village are not neglected. If you have no needs to be cared for, then I am happy to leave you alone and forgotten until the Avatar returns." As expected, that last part caught everyone's attention. Xing didn't bother hiding his smirk. "We made a deal, and he's coming back to Ba Sing Se to master firebending. I'd like to think he'd be elated to find that he's not the last of the air nomads." It gave the villagers pause for all of 2 seconds before another elder spoke up. "You will not make us hostages." "For hell's sake," Xing muttered as he ran a hand down his face. Despite the lengthy negotiations, they eventually parted with some satisfaction for both parties. Xing managed to partially convince the village of Hidden Clouds of his sincerity, and Ba Sing Se would continue to leave them alone for now. At the same time, the villagers reluctantly agreed to deliver a list of improvements that they'd like for their homes, as a sort of trial run for Xing. In the meantime, the false buildings, just hills of raised earth masked by walls, really, would be cleared out to allow the village to expand, while the workshops would be relocated to make space for an administrative office block, to covertly serve as a convenient meeting point for the airbenders. "Well, on the bright side," Xing remarked with heavy humor as they returned to the palace, and Mosey did not like the look the prince gave him. "At least we know you're strictly just effective against the Earth Kingdom." None of the villagers there stopped to admire your presence. That managed to bring out some chuckles from the troops around him, but Mosey was far from amused. "Seriously, Xing?" The return to Ba Sing Se was begrudging, but also relieving in its own way. The meeting with Hama had shaken the gang, but Sokka had to admit that it hardened his sister for the better. Katara was quieter for a couple of days, no doubt struggling to come to terms with the horrific act that was bloodbending. They'd left before Hama's execution was summarily enforced, and for once Aang didn't even try to argue the point. The flight away from the Fire Nation Islands was quiet, and even Toph held her quips back when Aang decided to give up the search for a firebending master on their own and seek Xing out. "The faster I get the firebending over with, the faster I can put an end to this war, so I can find and help more people like Hama before they lose themselves completely." It was a noble excuse, but Sokka also wondered if Aang was also entertaining the same fact that he had, that learning under a monster, and a particularly successful one at that, in supposedly conditional terms, might help equip them to identify and deal with more monsters in the future. Regardless, Appa flew with no deviations and limited stops, reaching Ba Sing Se in a matter of days. As per their agreement with the Scorpion, the gang flew in at night, keeping high in the sky until their landing within the palace courtyard. The soldiers that greeted them kept their spears at ease, and they wasted little time in escorting the gang into a corner of a palace wing that was all for themselves. Toph was the most comfortable amidst all of that, especially when it turned out that one of the Fire Nation soldiers guiding them was Captain Ping, who had captured her back during the whole drill thing. This whole area was meant to house guests of significant rank, so there's bedrooms for not just the nobility, but their servants as well, the cheery captain explained. Plus, private baths just around the corridor there. That whole row are basically offices and study rooms, and there's a couple of halls there. And there. Feel free to use the rooms in this section however you see fit. Prince Xing is still working on figuring out how to renovate the palace to be more practical. They spent their first night in a scorpion-controlled Ba Sing Se in the same opulent bedroom. Appa managed to fit in by virtue of Toph bending the walls open to let him in. It was that spacious. The following morning began with an invitation to have breakfast with the Scorpion Prince. Sokka was surprised to find the meal rather simple considering where they were eating. The table was basically filled with steaming hot buns, with colored pips on them to denote their fillings like most Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation eateries practice. Xing seemed content with slowly enjoying his bread as he conversed. "I'm glad you're back faster than expected." Annoyingly, he wasn't being smug about it, or if he was, his tone was hiding it really well, Sokka thought. "I just decided to get this over with," Aang curtly replied, reluctantly chewing on a bean paste-filled bun and begrudgingly enjoying the taste of it. Sokka knew the other boy liked it because he had wolfed down that same flavor, and boy did it taste better than just about every place else. Or maybe Aang was just too annoyed with Xing to properly enjoy the rich flavor. Even Katara had lowered her guard a bit as she munched away, unable to hide how much she was savoring the bread. Toph, of course, was freely gobbling down the buns like they were about to expire. Well, to not waste your time further, Xing nodded towards the other guest by the table. Sokka recognized the old man as Zuko's somewhat laconic traveling companion. The guy actually managed to exude a harmless air about him during their encounters. And even now he gave a slow and warm nod in greetings behind a curtain of steaming tea. May I present to you the Dragon of the West, Prince Iroh. He's Prince Zuko's uncle, in case you weren't aware. Wait, doesn't that make you dash? Toph tapped the stone table with her hand, causing a small pillar to unkindly poke into Sokka's side to shut him up. Hey! Iroh smiled as he ignored the commotion. It would be an honor to aid you in your lessons, young Avatar. Hi. How's Zuko? Iroh's smile didn't waver as he answered Aang's awkward question. I'd like to think he's doing better now that he is no longer burdened from chasing you. Oh, that's nice. I'm glad we don't have to deal with him anymore then. No offense. None taken, the prince said with a sagely shake of his head as he put down his bowl of tea. He had forced himself into that role, which in turn forced you through hardship. For that, I must apologize on behalf of my nephew. Aang squirmed a bit in his seat with discomfort as the old firebender bowed his head at him. Sokka felt the second-hand pang of awkwardness at receiving the genuine apology. It's all right, Aang managed to say. Xing cut through the brewing weirdness with a polite cough. If you agree, Prince Iroh will teach you firebending to the best of his abilities. He then looked to Katara and Toph. If you wish, I have people who might be capable of providing you further lessons in water and earthbending. And then the scorpion's gaze rested on Sokka. And practical combat training. That's mighty accommodating of him, but why are you being so generous? Katara asked with an arched eyebrow. We know that you helping us plays into some scheme of yours, but I thought you'd only want to have Aang trained. Xing shrugged as he tore a bun in half. I'm already making an investment. Might as well not half-ass it. There's no nuance in how treachery is perceived, after all. That little reminder that he was doing this behind the Fire Lord's back, with the Fire Lord's own brother being complicit too, further impressed on the gang of the surrealness of the situation. Xing then gave Katara and Sokka a smirk that was somewhat comforting in its annoying smugness. Besides, I'm told that I'm a sucker when it comes to reuniting families. Families? Sokka blurted. As if on cue, the old waterbender that Sokka had met once in Lake Laogai entered the feast hall, wearing a much warmer smile instead of the stern face she had back then. Sokka felt a bit wary at first, but then he noticed her wet eyes and how wary she herself was being in her movements. These are Hakoda's children. Katara immediately rose up. You know our dad. Sokka, Katara. May present to you Elder Kylan, Aunt of Hakoda. That makes her your grandaunt. The siblings were up and walking with disbelief towards the old woman, and Sokka found himself too fixated on the staggering implications of the words to care about Xing's stupid and smug delivery. Despite his misgivings, Aang found it truly hard to dislike Iroh. The prince was far more affable than Xing, and was proving to be a far better teacher than Zhong Zhong in their first lesson. Just an hour after breakfast, they were sitting by a garden, with the guards considerately being out of sight. Now look into yourself. Focus your breathing. That's it. Let your chi flow with your breaths. Do not cage it, but guide it, like a waterbender might. Thanks to Iroh's guidance and Aang's own matured and patient approach to mastering the elements, the flames were conjured and harnessed with ease. Through using the other elements as references, the prince made firebending a lot easier for the young avatar to grasp. In that introductory lesson, Aang found himself rather proud of his progress, as well as admiring Iroh immensely as a tutor. For a member of Fire Nation royalty, Prince Iroh was a far nicer guy than expected. A shame that he seemed to be the exception, rather than the rule. You've made good progress, Avatar Aang, he said when they took a break. It should not require too much work to lay the foundations of your firebending. Then we can move on to properly harnessing chi and controlling your flames. Please just call me Aang. If you insist, Iroh answered with refreshing earnestness compared to Xing's snark. Now, while we rest, do you have any questions for me? Why are you helping me? Aang immediately blurted out before he knew it. Well, too late to take it back, so he carried on with his question. I mean, you're the Fire Lord's brother, right? And you helped Zuko chase us. Iroha's smile faltered a bit, but he still answered without hesitation. I once shared my father's and grandfather's vision for the Fire Nation, but, serving in the field, I saw too late the horrible mistakes we had wrought on others. Iroh paused as emotions flashes across his kindly features. To my shame, it took me the loss of my own son to realize that. I'm sorry, Aang immediately said. Thank you. There was another brief pause before the prince continued. It took some time before I understood fully what the Fire Nation had done, and I sought ways to make amends. It might be hard to believe, but I followed Zuko as much to ensure both his safety and yours. Seeing the prince as he was now, Aang believed him. Thank you, by the way, for not leaving my nephew to freeze out in the North Pole. It was the right thing to do, the airbender immediately answered, remembering how Sokka had casually asked him to just leave Zuko in the cold wasteland. Iroh beamed a smile as he nodded. That it was. Unfortunately, too many people forget about that. Doing the right thing for the sake of it. I bet, Aang muttered, thinking of a particular scorpion especially. Iroh chuckled as he rose up to his feet. You are the second person to help my nephew unconditionally, and the first to do so honestly. Thank you, Aang. Feeling embarrassed for some reason, the boy reflexively scratched the back of his head. It's no biggie, really. Then he registered the first half of the prince's words. What did you mean by that, though? How did the first guy help Zuko? Dishonestly. The Dragon of the West gave a wry smile. It's a bit of a funny story, really. Xing tries to hide it, but he wait. Xing, there was no way that scorpion did anything simply for the sake of being good. Indeed, Iroh said, betraying Aang's expectations. The young prince tries to hide it, but beneath all his scheming, his altruism is not that hard to pick out. Against his better judgment, Aang spent a considerable amount of time listening to Iroh tell stories about Xing, stories that were far from what the general rumors about him said. The unexpectedly tragic past brought Hama back to mind, but the young air nomad pushed it aside for now. By the end of the day, he came to an understanding of the Scorpion Prince's way of thinking. Aang didn't agree practically all of it, but he understood the reasoning behind Xing's brutality, somewhat. My, how time flies, Iroh commented as the afternoon sun began to set. Come, Aang. I've been told to get you ready for dinner. We have guests that are keen to meet you. At an earlier time, Aang might have been wary of the Fire Nation Prince's words, but now he simply took it at face value. Do you know who's coming? I am not acquainted with him, but I'm told that you know who the mechanist is? He's here. Excitement was tempered with a pointed realization. Why is he here? Iroh shrugged as he began to lead them out of the garden. He and his son has agreed to work for Xing in helping to modernize Ba Sing Se. Of course Xing found out about the mechanist, and found a way to get him down here. Wait, Teo's here as well? How did he dash? Aang stopped as he saw Iroh tense up, and then the prince quickly turned and lunged at him, tackling the surprised boy to the ground as the ground beside him erupted in a sudden explosion. A good operative carried out orders to the letter and reported back only when total success was achieved. An excellent operative knew how to better meet the intentions of their given contract. Baozha liked to think of himself as the latter, and he saw the opportunity that presented itself when his quarry appeared with the Avatar. Stalking Prince Iroh had been troublesome due to the security of the palace, and the mission to cast suspicion on Xing, as the Fire Lord had requested, was nigh impossible due to how unexpectedly close both princes were. The amateurish insurgency made the assassins work harder, as everyone was on edge. Though Baozha had to admit that the way the Scorpion Prince dealt with his prisoners was highly impressive in execution and intention. Worse, what little of Xing's so-called invisible firebending that he managed to glimpse was completely different from Baozha's own explosions. So to accomplish the spirit of the contract, the initial order had to be discarded completely. Baozha was ready to settle for simply smothering Prince Iroh to death and plant the right amount of evidence to point towards Xing. It was orthodox and boring, but subtlety could rarely be solved with explosions in the first place. But now, with the Avatar being in Ba Sing Se, under both princes' warm welcome too, Baozha found his opportunity. Interestingly, it looked like the last air nomad was wary of his hosts. It was sheer luck that his lookout perch had a clear view to the garden Iroh and the airbender was in. And though he was too far to hear the conversation, the assassin understood well enough that the old prince was teaching the Avatar firebending. Baozha delivered his attack once he was certain he had the clearest shot possible. He tightly focused the chi out his third eye, but he didn't wait to confirm its results. The avatar's death or maiming was a nice bonus, but more importantly, it would serve as a potent distraction for the occupying forces. If the avatar or Prince Iroh was wounded or worse, Baozhao was sure that he would hear of it well before he left the city's outer walls. No, the avatar was secondary here. What was important was to deliver to the Fire Lord the all-important justification that he needed. Both the recently promoted Prince Xing and the retired Prince Iroh were party to a most treacherous conspiracy against the Fire Nation. Whether the Crown Princess was involved was irrelevant. Fire Lord Ozai would no doubt make it so or otherwise depending on his needs once he received this damning news. The Scorpion Dragon and the Dragon of the West would be denounced as traitors, and the Fire Lord can then send his own forces to deal with them. And Baozhao would hopefully be able to spend his well-earned pay in peace instead of having to face down those admittedly fearsome firebenders by himself. While Twinkletoes was out training and the Water siblings were enjoying a sappy reunion, Toph spent her time exploring the palace. Her meeting with Yama had been short. The old fart had acknowledged that there wasn't much he could teach her in terms of actual earthbending. Plus, he was more interested in berating his staff over attending to Boss Sing Se's needs. He did offer to teach her some tactics, though, which Toph took a rain check on. Honestly, the old man seemed too eager to be stuck in boring administration instead of doing any actual bending. Apparently, Yama was going to make the best of his long-awaited return home by unscrewing things up, so she let it slide. As before, the Fire Nation soldiers who guarded the palace barely gave her any thought, save for a quick inquiry about whether she needed any directions. Robed officials barely afforded her a glance as they hurried past her, and servants simply nodded in deference without being too patronizing in their attention. With the exception of one particular wing, which contained something, based on the vibrations she picked up, Toph was free to wander the place. It'd be a more meaningful exploration if she could see the decor, the girl supposed, but her tremor sense already picked up a lot of interesting things about the opulent construction around her. Xing had been very thorough in taking the palace. The pockets of messily compacted earth spoke up filled secret tunnels and chambers. Cold metal plates braced what were once false walls to stop them from swiveling or sliding open. The same occurred to the listening chambers in the ceiling. Toph could just make out the once hidden spots to eavesdrop from by the difference in consistency of the earthworks. It seems that the Fire Nation conquerors really got the Li singing to have the palace so cleaned up. Also of interest were the guests Xing was entertaining in the throne room. Toph only needed to stand by the walls outside to pick up on Xing standing by the vandalized Earth King's throne, addressing a man and a boy in some sort of conversation. Judging from how the latter guest gave tense movements, the meeting might be reluctant on their part. Reluctant on the boy's end anyway. The man just seemed sanguine about the whole thing and was constantly calming down the boy. There were other curiosities in the palace that took up Toph's day. She found the dragons flitting about and playing with a toddler in a not-so-hidden room, overheard Generals Yu and Sung reminding their officers to behave, and in the process learn about General Fong's ill-fated attempt at dethroning Xing, and spent some time focusing on the footwork of some soldiers in training. The quick and nimble movements were interesting enough that Toph began wondering if she could incorporate that into her own bending for rapid reactions. Maybe it's something to ask Grumpy Yama later. Toph felt the ripples of the explosions before she heard the muted thunderclap echoing off the walls. She was ready to write it off as firebender shenanigans, but hurried towards the source when she picked up the guards moving hurriedly. As she got closer, the ground provided greater and greater detail of what had transpired. Prince Iroh was down, and Aang was kneeling beside him with worry. A few of the palace guards were attending them, while others fanned out in search of something or someone. More soldiers were converging, armed and alert. Katara and Sokka were running towards the site as well, with their grandaunt surprisingly keeping up with them. Xing blinked across Toph's tremor sense, probably from jetting through the hallway. By the time Toph actually arrived at the crater that ate up half the garden, the soldiers had all left to conduct a search, while Katara and her grandaunt Kylan were tending to a groaning Prince Iroh. The vibrations did not provide much details on his wounds, but it looked like the old prince's back was shredded by the explosion he and Aang narrowly avoided. Froze for a second, and then he pushed me down before the ground exploded, Aang briefed Xing, sounding a little rattled. For his part, the Prince of Ba Sing Se was coldly furious. his feet firmly rooted to the ground as his body tensed up. Did you see anything right up to the explosion? Smell. Here. The avatar shook his head. Nothing. It was an explosion. Yeah. Xing paused for a second, and then turned to a hunched man on all fours, busily combing through the crater. Hyung, anything? I can tell you the point of the explosion, but there's no trace of its fuel, Hyung reported with clear annoyance, his hand sweeping through the dirt. It's like fire bending, except, well, explosive. And strong, too, to tear up so much dirt. How strong? The hunched man shrugged. It's not going to melt through Boss Sing Se's walls like you. But it'll take out most buildings, I'm guessing. Wait, a firebender did this? Sokka incredulously cut in. Xing glanced at her and gave a tentative nod. It seems so. Toph picked up the sudden freeze and a spark of something from him as he trailed off and shifted his balance a little. Xing quickly turned to the nearby soldiers with urgency. Send a message out to the hunters. Our target's likely with a third eye. Third eye. Probably a tattoo or scar. Capture only if certain of success. Yes, my prince. Send the message to Mosey as well. I'll get him up to speed in a bit. This time it was Aang who interrupted. You know who did this? I have a hunch. Hopefully it's accurate. Oh, right. The scorpion and his spirits. Guess that tale's true. Hold on just a moment, Katara said, and Toph immediately braced herself for the waterbender's incoming nonsense. Why is everyone taking your word for granted? Toph was wrong. She'd expected Sugar Queen to be complaining about how Aang almost got killed. Still, the question made pretty much all the Fire Nation people in the garden, except for Prince Iroh, who was busy being healed, shift their feet with annoyance. Xing, though, just gave her a mildly amused look. I'm not responsible for this, if that's what you're insinuating. I'm not, but Xing's sources have not led him astray yet, Katara, Kylan soothed, with a surprising amount of ice under her warm tone. And he's not lying. Toph decided to chip in before the other girl decided to stick her foot in her mouth. There were way too many firebenders here to rile up. Aang looked at her weirdly. How can you tell? Right, she never did tell anyone about her lie detecting. She walked up beside Xing and tapped her foot. I can feel his breathing and his heartbeat. When people lie, there's a physical reaction. Xing's telling the truth when he says he's not really sure. Or he's a very good liar, Sokka decided to say, and which redirected the annoyed gazes his way. Hey, I'm being hypothetical here. Xing shook his head. We're wasting time. Avatar Aang. I'll have to ask you to stay within the palace for the rest of the day while we sort this out. Shouldn't we help you? I mean, Appa can fly to cover more ground. It'd defeat the point of our secrecy up until now. Oh, right. Toph felt the young prince's posture stiffen as he spared a brief glance at Prince Iroh, who was now serenely snoring away from a healing-induced sleep. In any case, this is my responsibility as a host. Someone has tried to make a lie of my hospitality. Elder Kylan, I entrust Prince Iroh's well-being to your care. Sergeant, tell Colonel Mosey to increase security. He'll know what to do. Quan, tell the others to catch up with me. Koshi, try and keep up. Without waiting for everyone's acknowledgement, the scorpion shot up into the air with a roaring blast of fire, followed shortly after by a man who should be Koshi. Toph glanced to her friends and felt their lost looks from the ripples of their movement. What do we do now? Baozha had thought he was doing a great job at extracting himself from the inner ring. The routes and detours had been extensively planned out, down to what alleys to turn into at what time. He had 4 ostrich horses waiting at different points, and 2 carriages booked to receive his arrival at opposing ends of the middle ring. There were no delusions of being able to blend in with the city's populace, not with how badly he stood out with his larger build and poorer attire. So Baozha stuck to the shadows of rooftops and balconies, dropping down to alleyways only for short sprints to cross certain areas. All avenues of escape were clear, but the assassin had not factored in that his vengeful hunters would so brazenly soar across the skies in groups. He'd poorly assumed that the rumors of the 11th flying across battlefields were hyperbole. Most firebenders capable of doing such a feat tended to stick to the ground to conserve their energy, after all. It was a stupid mistake that cost Baozha valuable time. Now his movement was severely hampered. Even the most alert guards on the ground tended to look forwards rather than up unless given reason to. But firebenders bounding through the air had a clear view of the rooftops below them. To make things worse, the assassin spied the bright flame of the young prince taking part in the manhunt. Unlike the others who leapt from street to street, Xing shot up almost completely vertically into the air, and then glided down in a slow spiral, using his robes to slow his descent. It would have been a comical sight, if not for how much trouble Baozha was in to appreciate it. His window of escape was closing too quickly. Either he had to go to ground, or force a breakthrough. For the sake of actually accomplishing his mission, Baozha drew in a breath, and then shot out from under the roof he was hiding. The burst of qi was sent skywards, and Baozha was already running before the explosion went off. As expected, the shouts of alarm from the palace garrison initially drew them to the explosion itself, buying him precious time and distance. Unfortunately, his break didn't last too long, as the scorpion's yell not only told Baozha that he'd missed, but that the boy had seen him as well. He quickly dove down to the streets and broke into a run through the confused and panicked populace. If the rumors of the 11th's flight had been proven true, then their softness for civilians of any stripe should also be accurate. And to Baozha's relief it was. He heard their furious yells behind and beside him, but by keeping near the city folk, Baozha managed to spoil their aim and resolve. Some guards of red and green formed on the road ahead with spears lowered, so the assassin took in a breath and exhaled out a beam of qi that erupted within the formation and blasted them clear. He ran past the broken bodies, caving in the head of an intact survivor with a kick of his metal leg on the way to further reduce the enemy count by one. For all the people hounding him, escape was becoming a certainty for Baozha. The soldiers dared not attack him, especially once he managed to scoop up a blindly fleeing woman to use as a shield. Once he reached the gates of the inner ring, a focused blast would kick up enough of a debris cloud to cover his escape. There was a well nearby that he could drop into, with a convenient hiding spot he'd quietly dug several nights before. Or he could use the false wall of an unoccupied house he'd scouted just yesterday. It'd require a bigger debris cloud, but it'd most definitely keep him hidden, before the assassin could further run through the other alternative escape plans. His instincts screamed, and he skipped aside as the ground he would have trod on collapsed into a hole. Baozha fought down the urge to even hiss his annoyance as the city's earthbenders finally caught up. Freakin' three-eyed prick, an old earthbender spat as he made his entrance by churning the road into a wave that raced towards the assassin. "You don't cause shit in my city." Baozha had to let go of his wailing hostage to leap for the safety of a nearby balcony. As a precaution, he created a dome of explosions to ward off his snarling hunters. It bought him just enough time to climb back to the roofs and continue his escape. Better to face just firebenders in the open than both firebenders and earthbenders on the streets. Or so he thought, until a fat tail of water smacked into him and knocked him down onto the ground. Baozha just had enough time to see a group of waterbenders in action before another water whip slammed him down into the ground. He barely had time to register his bones cracking, and the air knocked out of his lungs from the impact when the paved road around him rose up like parted waves. As the earth fell back down to swallow him with claustrophobic darkness, the professional part of Baozha was grateful for his foresight of sending out his raven eagle before he began fleeing. Hopefully, a mere letter instead of a personal report would be enough to sway the Fire Lord. Let it be said that Baozha never once failed his contracts.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.